I am Clara Sterling, 34 years old, and supposedly the biggest disappointment to carry the family name, or so my father believed. For 5 years I sat in a windowless office at Sterling Medical, fixing the accounting errors my older brother Julian made covering up his disastrous supplier negotiations and keeping the company from drowning in debt. I did the work of a chief financial officer while collecting the salary of a junior clerk. My father Richard saw this as my natural ceiling. He often said I lacked the predatory instinct required for real business. So when the time came for him to retire, he took us to the most expensive steakhouse in Seattle. He raised a glass of vintage wine and handed Julian 60% of the company and the title of Chief Executive Officer. Julian, a man who once lost $3 million on a failed software integration because he refused to read the user manual. To me, my father slid a thin paper envelope across the table. Inside was a generic greeting card that read, "Thanks for pitching in." He told me I was not business material. He told me I should be grateful to keep my desk job under my brother's leadership. Julian laughed, swallowed his steak, and ordered me to pack up his old office boxes by Monday morning. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I just smiled, placed a solid metal credit card on the leather billfold to cover their extravagant dinner, and walked away. They thought they had put me in my place. They had no idea they had just signed their own financial death warrants. 90 days later, I would walk into their boardroom and take everything they owned. Before I explain exactly how I orchestrated the hostile takeover of my own family, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is right now in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you know what it is like to outsmart the people who constantly belittle your worth. Now, let me take you back to that dinner in downtown Seattle, the exact moment the Sterling Empire began to fall. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Metropolitan Grill. Inside, the air smelled of roasted bone marrow and aged bourbon. We sat in a private mahogany booth, shielded from the rest of the dining room. Richard Sterling sat at the head of the table. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that hid the slight stoop in his shoulders, a physical toll from 40 years of running Sterling Medical. To his right sat Julian. My brother wore a smirk that seemed permanently etched into his features, adjusting his silk tie every few minutes to ensure the lighting caught the fabric. Beside Julian sat his wife, Maya. She was a senior associate at a prominent corporate law firm, a brilliant black woman who possessed a predatory legal mind. Maya kept her posture rigid, her gaze darting between her husband and me. She knew the numbers. She knew the reality of the company. Yet she remained silent, sipping her sparkling water, playing the role of the supportive spouse while clearly detesting the script. I sat across from Julian. My plate of sea bass sat untouched. I had spent the last 5 years functioning as the uncredited financial anchor of this family. When Julian approved a disastrous vendor contract that bled our quarterly profits by 12%, I spent 3 sleepless weekends restructuring our supply chain to avoid a credit downgrade. When my father forgot to file compliance reports with the federal health regulators, I forged the necessary audit trails to keep the doors open. I did all of this under the title of senior bookkeeper. Richard raised his glass of reserve Cabernet. The crystal caught the dim light of the chandelier. "To the future," my father announced. His voice held the same baritone resonance he used to intimidate rival executives. "Tonight marks the end of an era and the beginning of a dynasty. As of tomorrow morning, I am stepping down as Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Medical." Julian puffed out his chest. He reached for his own glass, eager to receive his crown. "I have transferred 60% of my voting shares to Julian," Richard continued. "He has the vision. He has the Sterling charisma. He knows how to shake hands and close deals. The board has already been notified. He is the new head of this family." Julian grinned. "I appreciate the trust, Dad. I am ready to take us public. We are going to scale this operation, double the marketing budget, rebrand the whole enterprise." Maya blinked. Her hand paused over her water glass. She cast a swift, unreadable glance toward me. Doubling a marketing budget for a medical device manufacturer struggling with basic cash flow was fiscal suicide. I knew it. Maya knew it. Julian remained entirely oblivious. Richard turned his attention to me. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a clinical detachment. "Clara." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a thin paper envelope. He slid it across the polished wood. It stopped inches from my plate. You have always been a reliable worker. Reliable but safe. You lack the edge required to navigate the modern market. You get lost in spreadsheets. But every ship needs someone in the engine room. I picked up the envelope. The paper felt cheap rough against my fingertips. I broke the seal and pulled out the card. It was a generic drugstore greeting card featuring a cartoon bear giving a thumbs up. Printed inside in standard black font were the words, "Thanks for pitching in." Below that, Richard had hastily scribbled his initials in blue ink. No bonus check, no stock options, not even a meaningful title bump. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Listen, Clara, I am going to need you to come in early tomorrow. My new corner office needs to be cleared out. The maintenance guys are slow, and I want my new desk set up before the morning briefing. Make sure those old filing cabinets are hauled down to the basement." He was not asking. He was giving an order to the woman who had saved him from federal indictments just a year prior. He wanted me to haul boxes. I looked at Maya. Her jaw tightened. She looked away, staring fixedly at the rain lashing against the glass. She was trapped in her own gilded cage, tied to a man she was rapidly outgrowing. I looked back at my father. "You are handing the entire enterprise to Julian." I stated the fact evenly. No tremor in my voice, no unshed tears. "He is your older brother," Richard replied, cutting into his steak. "He is a natural leader. You are a detail-oriented person, Clara. There is no shame in knowing your limits. We need you to keep the ledgers tidy while Julian handles the big picture." The waiter approached our booth carrying a leather billfold. He placed it discreetly near Richard. The dinner celebration had accrued a rather staggering total. My father patted his jacket pockets, performing a familiar theatrical routine. He smiled at his son. "Well, Julian, you are the boss now. Why do you not handle the first executive expense?" Julian chuckled, pulling a platinum corporate card from his wallet. He tossed it onto the billfold with a flick of his wrist, put it on the company tab. The waiter nodded, taking the leather booklet and disappearing into the ambient noise of the restaurant. We sat in silence. Julian began outlining his plans to buy a new sports car to celebrate his promotion. Richard nodded along, offering advice on which dealership offered the best lease terms. They were celebrating a victory they had not earned, spending money they no longer possessed. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He approached Julian, leaning in close to keep his voice discreet. "Sir, I apologize." The card was declined. Julian stopped talking. His face flushed a dark, angry red. "Declined. Run it again. Your machine must be broken. I ran it twice. Sear." The bank returned a hard refusal. "Insufficient funds." Richard frowned. "Julian, what is going on with the expense account?" "It is just a bank error," Julian snapped, avoiding his father's gaze. He fumbled for his personal debit card, but his hands were clumsy. The bravado from moments ago evaporated. Maya watched him struggle, her expression hardening into thinly veiled contempt. I reached for my purse. For 5 years I had maintained a separate existence. Every morning I played the quiet bookkeeper for Sterling Medical. Every evening and on every weekend I operated under my true capacity. I was a senior partner at Vanguard Acquisitions. I specialized in corporate restructuring and hostile takeovers. My personal portfolio dwarfed the entire net worth of the Sterling family. I had only stayed at the family business to honor a promise I made to my dying mother, a promise to keep her life's work safe. But Richard had just handed her legacy to a man who could not even afford a dinner tab. I pulled out a heavy metal card. It was matte black, devoid of the usual bank logos, bearing only my name. I held it out to the waiter. "Use this." The waiter took the heavy metal card, recognizing what it was immediately. He nodded with sudden deference and walked away. Julian stared at my hands. "What kind of card is that?" Richard narrowed his eyes. "Clara, what are you doing? We do not need you paying for this. Julian just needs to call his bank tomorrow and clear up the fraud alert." I picked up the greeting card. I folded the cheap paper in half and tucked it into my purse. I looked at the two men who had spent my entire life measuring me against an impossible standard and finding me lacking. I stood up from the booth. I smoothed the fabric of my skirt. The waiter returned, handing me the receipt and my card. I added a generous tip, signed the slip with a quick flourish, and placed the metal card back into my bag. "You do not need to call the bank, Julian," I said. My voice was calm, holding the steady cadence of a woman closing a negotiation. "The corporate account is empty because you authorized that ridiculous digital marketing campaign last week without checking the cash reserves. You drained the operating fund. Julian opened his mouth to argue, but no sound emerged. He looked at Maya, hoping for a defense, but his wife remained silent, her eyes fixed on me with sudden, sharp interest. Richard stood up, his face darkening. "Clara, sit down. Do not speak to your brother that way." I met my father's gaze, the man who had just told me I had no instinct for business. "I am not speaking to my brother," I replied. "I am speaking to a man who just bankrupted his own company on his first day as chief executive officer." I picked up my coat. I slung my purse over my shoulder. "Where are you going?" Richard demanded. "We are not finished here. You will sit down and explain what you mean about the operating fund." I looked at Julian, who was still staring at the leather billfold. "Just enjoy the throne, Julian. I will not be in tomorrow to pack your boxes. I will not be in ever again." I turned and walked out of the private booth. I did not look back to see their expressions. I walked through the crowded restaurant, stepping out into the cold Seattle rain. The air felt remarkably clean. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I used only for my real work. My contact at Vanguard answered on the first ring. "The Sterling medical account," I said, stepping into the back of a waiting town car. "The grace period is over. Begin the financial sweep tomorrow morning. I want every debt they owe cataloged and prepared for purchase." I ended the call. They had handed me a $2 card. In return, I was going to take their entire empire. The transition from the obedient daughter to the apex predator took exactly 38 minutes. That was the duration of the town car ride from the steakhouse in downtown Seattle to my penthouse in Bellevue. I discarded the beige cardigan and the sensible flats I wore to play the role of the docile bookkeeper. By 5 o'clock the next morning, I stepped onto the top floor of the Columbia Center, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that commanded the room before I even spoke a word. This was Vanguard Acquisitions. We did not build companies. We dissected them. We found bloated, failing corporations, stripped them of their usable assets, and sold the remnants to the highest bidder. My colleagues knew me as a senior partner with a ruthless eye for distressed assets. They respected my boundaries, and I kept my lineage strictly separated from my portfolio. My father and brother believed I spent my days verifying expense reports in a windowless cubicle. They never realized my actual job involved liquidating executives exactly like them. I walked into my corner office, the floor-to-ceiling glass, offering an unobstructed view of the Puget Sound. I bypassed the espresso machine and went straight to the dual monitors on my desk. The opening bell on Wall Street was hours away, but the pre-market trading data was already bleeding across the screens. I typed the ticker symbol for Sterling Medical. The numbers blinked in a steady stream of red. My brother had been the chief executive officer for less than 12 hours, and he was already immolating the family legacy. Julian had spent his first night in power approving a $2 million marketing initiative. I pulled up the digital press release he had pushed live at midnight. It was a masterclass in executive vanity. He had hired a celebrity public relations firm in Los Angeles to rebrand a company that manufactured surgical tubing and dialysis machine components. He authorized full-page spreads in lifestyle magazines and secured billboard space in Times Square. Julian wanted to be a tech visionary. He forgot he was selling sterile plastic to hospital procurement administrators. The investors recognized the delusion instantly. Institutional shareholders despise vanity projects, especially from a company already struggling with its cash flow. The pre-market trading volume surged as panicked investors began dumping their shares. My phone vibrated on the glass desk. A single encrypted text message appeared on the screen. It was from Maya. "Julian is locking himself in his office. Board members are calling. He is blaming the PR firm." I locked my phone and slid it into my pocket. Maya was the only intelligent variable in Julian's orbit. As a corporate attorney, she recognized a sinking ship long before the hull breached the water. Her text was not a plea for help. It was a status report. She was positioning herself, gathering leverage for the inevitable fallout. I respected her survival instinct. The heavy glass door to my office swung open. Victor Thorne walked in holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. Victor was the founding partner of Vanguard, a man who viewed the financial markets as a chessboard where empathy was a fatal flaw. He possessed a shark-like ability to smell weakness, and right now the scent was wafting through the entire financial district. He stood beside my desk, his eyes locked on the cascading red numbers on my monitors. "Your brother is making quite an entrance," Victor noted, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "The stock is down 14% before the market even officially opens. The analysts are tearing his press release apart on the morning broadcasts. They are calling it the most expensive ego trip of the fiscal year." I kept my gaze fixed on the screen. "Julian assumes business is about optics. He thinks a new logo will fix a fractured supply chain." Victor leaned against the edge of my desk. He tapped his index finger against the glass. "The volatility is prime. We have a window here, Clara. We borrow a block of shares from the institutional holders, dump them to accelerate the panic, and buy them back at the bottom before the closing bell. A textbook short squeeze. We could clear $5 million in pure profit by the end of the week. It was a logical play. For any other firm, short-selling a crashing stock was the fastest route to a lucrative quarter. It was clean, efficient, and entirely impersonal. But this was not an impersonal trade. This was an execution I had been designing for 5 years. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk. I bypassed the standard client files and pulled out a thick red leather dossier. I dropped it onto the glass surface. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet office. Victor raised an eyebrow, staring at the folder. "What is that?" "That is the actual anatomy of Sterling Medical," I said, sliding the dossier toward him. "The public balance sheets my father filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission are an illusion. They show a company suffering from minor cash flow issues. The reality is a terminal diagnosis." Victor set his coffee mug down. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the top page. The casual interest in his posture vanished, replaced by the sharp focus of a predator analyzing a fresh kill. For the past 5 years, I continued my voice stripped of any warmth. I played the obedient clerk. I processed their invoices, I reconciled their ledgers, and I kept copies of every toxic contract Julian ever drafted. I mapped out the collateral my father pledged to keep the lights on. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the waking city. Julian did not just spend $2 million on a billboard campaign. He financed that campaign using a high-yield bridge loan with a balloon payment due in less than 90 days. He collateralized the manufacturing plant in Tacoma to secure the cash. Victor turned the page, his finger tracing a line of data I had compiled. He used a Tier 1 asset to fund a marketing stunt. "The board allowed this. The board consists of my father's golfing partners," I replied, turning back to face him. "They sign whatever Richard tells them to sign. And Richard signs whatever Julian puts in front of him, because acknowledging his son's incompetence would require acknowledging his own failure as a mentor. They are operating on blind arrogance." Victor closed the red folder. The silence in the office was heavy, charged with the sudden realization of the scale of my operation. "You did not bring this to Vanguard to make a quick trade on a short squeeze." I placed my hands flat on the desk, leaning closer to him. "Shorting the stock is a scavenger's tactic. We are not here to pick the meat off the bones and walk away. If we short the stock, we make a few million, and Richard finds another gullible bank to bail them out. They survive to limp through another fiscal year." I tapped the cover of the red dossier. "We do not want their stock. The equity is worthless. The power does not lie in the shares. The power lies in the debt." Victor met my eyes. He understood the architecture of the trap. "You want to buy the commercial paper." "I want all of it," I confirmed. "The bridge loan Julian just signed, the mezzanine debt Richard rolled over last quarter, the vendor financing agreements they have been delaying for 6 months. The institutional lenders are watching this morning's stock crash. They are terrified. They see a new, erratic chief executive officer burning through capital. The banks want out. They will sell those debt obligations at a steep discount just to clear their books of the risk." I straightened my posture, delivering the final verdict. "I do not want a quick profit, Victor. I want the manufacturing plants. I want the patents. I want the distribution network." Victor stared at the red folder for a long moment, then looked up at me, a slow, dangerous smile forming on his face. "No shorting," Clara declared, her eyes sharp and unforgiving. "We are going to buy up all their bad debt." The financial dragnet was set in motion. Victor deployed Vanguard's acquisition team to quietly approach the institutional lenders, offering to sweep the toxic Sterling Medical debt off their books. While they executed the strategy, I returned to my primary workstation, shifting my focus to the logistical vulnerabilities within Julian's crumbling empire. At exactly 10:45, my burner phone vibrated, grinding against the glass surface of the desk. The caller ID displayed the main executive line for Sterling Medical. Julian. He had realized the consequences of his morning vanity project, and now, true to form, he was looking for someone else to absorb the impact. I let it ring 3 times, allowing his anxiety to simmer before tapping the screen to connect the call. "Where the hell are you?" Julian's voice erupted through the speaker, frantic and strained, completely lacking the polished bravado he had displayed at the steakhouse the night before. "I am unavailable to haul your boxes, Julian," I answered smoothly, leaning back in my leather chair. "I resigned last night, if you recall. I do not care about the boxes." Julian snapped, his breathing erratic. "We have a crisis. Mercy Hospital just terminated their supply contract. $3 million in quarterly revenue gone." The procurement director cited a breach of confidence. He said our new marketing campaign makes us look like a volatile startup, not a reliable medical vendor. Mercy Hospital was the cornerstone of Sterling Medical's domestic revenue. Without that contract, the company would struggle to make payroll by the end of the month. Julian had driven the largest client away before his new business cards were even printed. "That sounds like an executive problem, Julian," I replied, my tone deliberately detached. "Perhaps you can fix the breach of confidence with another billboard in Times Square. Do not play games with me, Clara." Julian's voice dropped an octave, shifting from panic to venom. "I need you back at your desk. You negotiated the original terms with Mercy. You know the procurement director. I need you to call him, grovel if you have to, and draft a concession agreement to get that contract reinstated today. I am no longer an employee. You cannot assign me tasks. I am not asking as your boss, Clara. I am telling you as the head of this family." The underlying threat was palpable. Dad transferred the executor rights of Mom's trust to me this morning. You remember the trust right, the one holding the vacation property in Aspen and the remaining liquid assets. My mother had established that trust specifically to protect a portion of her wealth from my father's reckless spending. It was the only financial tie I still maintained with the family, a sentimental anchor I had neglected to sever. Julian was using my mother's legacy as a weapon. "If you do not fix the Mercy contract by 5 o'clock, Julian continued, sensing an advantage, "I will exercise my executive authority. I will restructure the disbursements. I will tie up your inheritance in legal reviews for the next decade. You will not see a dime. You want to walk away? Fine. But you do it empty-handed unless you clean up this mess." He was attempting extortion using the emotional weight of a deceased parent to force compliance. He expected me to crumble to prioritize the sentimental value of the trust over my independence. He fundamentally miscalculated the threshold of my attachment. Before I could deliver a response that would shatter his perceived leverage, the audio on the line muffled sharply, accompanied by the distinct sound of a physical struggle for the receiver. "Give me the phone, Julian." Maya's voice sliced through the background noise, sharp and authoritative. A brief, muted altercation ensued before Maya spoke directly into the receiver. "Clara, are you there?" Maya's tone was entirely different from Julian's unhinged aggression. It was the calculated, precise cadence she utilized in courtrooms. Maya and I were not friends. Our relationship was defined by a cautious mutual respect, born from the shared experience of navigating the suffocating ego of the Sterling men. She endured Julian because he provided access to a specific tier of Seattle society, but she never respected his intellect. Now it seemed her tolerance had evaporated. "I am here, Maya," I replied, matching her formal tone. "Your brother is currently indisposed, attempting to locate his misplaced composure," Maya stated, a subtle edge of derision in her voice. "He is struggling to grasp the complexities of client retention. In fact, he is quite desperate to locate the archived client rosters from your tenure. He believes those dormant accounts might contain immediate liquidity." My eyes narrowed. The dormant accounts. Those were the client files I had personally managed before Richard reassigned me to internal bookkeeping. They were complex, high-maintenance relationships that required delicate handling, not the aggressive sales tactics Julian favored. If Julian accessed those files, he would alienate the remaining goodwill the company possessed. But those files were encrypted on a segregated server protected by access protocols I had established. Maya continued, her phrasing deliberate, almost mechanical. "It is unfortunate that the legacy server requires a specific administrative bypass. Julian is currently reviewing the indemnification clauses regarding intellectual property. He seems convinced he can override the system restrictions manually to extract the data. I sat forward, the pieces aligning rapidly. Maya was not calling to mediate. She was delivering a coded warning. Julian was attempting a brute force hack into my old client database, desperate to steal the contacts and secure quick cash. But Maya, a corporate lawyer, was referencing indemnification and manual overrides. She was pointing me toward a specific vulnerability within the company's digital infrastructure. I appreciate the update on his activities, Maya, I said carefully. Intellectual property disputes can be quite messy. I assume you are advising him on the legal ramifications of unauthorized data extraction. Of course, Maya replied, her voice smooth. I am merely ensuring all liabilities are properly documented, especially the off-book liabilities, the ones that fall outside standard corporate governance, the mezzanine structures. The line went dead. Maya had hung up. I stared at the phone. The mezzanine structures. Maya had deliberately highlighted an anomalous financial term. Mezzanine debt is a hybrid of debt and equity financing, typically utilized by companies requiring rapid capital but lacking the tangible assets for a standard bank loan. It is expensive, dangerous, and often a last resort before bankruptcy. I spun my chair back to the dual monitors. I bypassed the standard financial models and initiated a secure VPN connection routing my access through a proxy server located in Geneva. I breached the Sterling Medical internal network, utilizing a backdoor administrative login I had created 3 years ago for emergency audits. I ignored the client databases Julian was clumsily trying to access. Maya had directed me elsewhere. I initiated a targeted search algorithm scanning the server for recent contracts categorized under alternative financing, specifically filtering for the term mezzanine. The system processed the query lines of code racing across the black screen. The search concluded highlighting a single heavily encrypted PDF document. The file was time-stamped 48 hours prior, mere days before the succession dinner. I initiated the decryption protocol, breaking through the rudimentary security measures Julian favored. The document opened, displaying a dense legal contract. I bypassed the standard boilerplate language and scrolled directly to the signature page and the collateralization schedules. The breath caught in my throat. The temperature in my office seemed to drop abruptly. The document was not a standard business loan. It was a predatory lending agreement executed with an entity named Vulture Capital Partners, a notorious shadow firm operating out of Chicago, known for targeting distressed family businesses and ruthlessly liquidating them. Julian had not just secured a loan. He had pledged the entire controlling interest of Sterling Medical, the 60% voting block Richard had handed him, as the sole collateral. He had mortgaged the family empire to an organization of corporate scavengers to secure a massive influx of untraceable cash. If he missed a single payment, Vulture Capital would possess the legal authority to seize the company entirely, bypassing the board of directors and rendering the remaining shares completely worthless. My brother had handed the keys to the kingdom to the most dangerous predators in the market. 2 hours after decrypting the loan documents, I was seated in the leather cabin of a chartered Gulfstream, cutting through the turbulent air above the Midwest. The flight to Chicago afforded me exactly enough time to compile the necessary leverage. Vanguard maintained an intelligence division that operated beyond the scope of traditional financial audits. We specialized in uncovering the buried sins of private equity managers. Silas Vance, the founding partner of Vulture Capital, possessed a remarkably extensive catalog of sins. I arrived at the Chicago headquarters of Vulture Capital shortly after 2 in the afternoon. The firm occupied the top 2 floors of a brutalist skyscraper in the Loop. The interior design was an exercise in intimidation. Dark slate floors, minimal lighting, and a reception desk carved from a single slab of obsidian. The environment was intended to make debtors feel small before they even entered a negotiation room. I walked past the receptionist without waiting to be announced and pushed open the heavy oak doors to the corner office. Silas Vance sat behind a sprawling desk, examining a physical ledger. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s wearing a pinstripe suit that cost more than most vehicles. He did not look up when I entered. He let the silence stretch a classic power play designed to force the other party into speaking first out of discomfort. I did not speak. I walked to the visitor chair, pulled it back, and sat down, crossing my legs and resting my briefcase on my lap. Silas finally raised his eyes. He possessed the cold, dead stare of a man who enriched himself by foreclosing on generational family businesses. "My assistant usually screens my appointments," Silas said, his voice a low, grating rumble. "You must be lost." "I am Clara Sterling," I replied, matching his volume. "I represent Vanguard Acquisitions. We are here to discuss the mezzanine debt you underwrote for Julian Sterling 48 hours ago." Silas leaned back in his chair. A patronizing smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Ah, the sister. Julian mentioned you might come crying. He said you were a glorified bookkeeper who did not understand high finance. Let me save you the trouble of begging. I am not calling the note early. I am not restructuring the interest rate. Your brother signed the collateral agreements. The Sterling manufacturing plants belong to me the minute he misses his first payment." He reached for a crystal tumbler of water. "You are out of your depth, little girl. Fly back to Seattle." I opened the brass clasps of my briefcase. I did not pull out a plea for leniency. I pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the expansive desk. It stopped directly over his leather-bound ledger. "I do not negotiate with loan sharks, Mr. Vance." I stated my tone, stripping away any pretense of corporate courtesy. "I dictate terms. You are going to sell the Sterling debt portfolio to Vanguard right now, and you are going to sell it at a 40% discount." Silas scoffed, ignoring the folder. "You must be delusional. I hold a prime asset securing a high-yield note. Why would I ever sell it to you at a loss? Because you are about to require a massive influx of liquid cash for your criminal defense attorneys," I said. His hand froze halfway to his water glass. The patronizing smile vanished. I gestured toward the folder. "Open it." Silas hesitated, then flipped the cover open. His eyes tracked the first page. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale hue. "Vanguard intelligence is quite thorough," I continued, leaning forward to ensure he heard every syllable. "You used a network of offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands to funnel capital into 3 major ventures last year: a cryptocurrency exchange, a commercial real estate syndicate in Miami, and a medical supply distributor in New Jersey." Silas swallowed hard. His breathing grew shallow. "Those investments generated spectacular returns," I noted, keeping my gaze locked on his eyes. "Unfortunately, the Department of Justice does not view money laundering favorably. The federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York have been building a RICO case against you for 8 months. They subpoenaed your banking records yesterday morning. The indictments will be unsealed by Friday." Silas tried to maintain his composure, but his fingers twitched against the edge of the folder. "This is fabricated. You hacked a few emails and printed a conspiracy theory. If it is a theory, then you have nothing to worry about," I countered smoothly. "But we both know it is the truth. When the federal indictment drops, the government will immediately freeze every asset tied to Vulture Capital. Your bank accounts, your property holdings, and your active loan portfolios will be seized pending trial. The Sterling medical debt you hold will become trapped in a federal evidence locker for years. You will not be able to collect a single dollar of interest, let alone foreclose on the collateral." I pulled a single sheet of paper from my briefcase. It was a digital transfer authorization pre-signed by Vanguard executives. "You need untraceable cash to fund your legal defense before the asset freeze hits," I told him, placing the authorization document next to his hand. "I am offering you an exit. Vanguard will wire the funds to an account of your choosing within 60 seconds of your signature. You take a 40% haircut on the principal, but you get clean money right now. If you refuse, I walk out that door and you face the federal prosecutors with empty pockets." Silas stared at the paper. The predatory arrogance that defined his career had shattered. He was a cornered animal weighing the cost of a financial loss against the reality of a federal prison sentence. He knew I possessed the leverage. He knew Vanguard had outmaneuvered him on a chessboard he thought he owned. Without uttering a single word, Silas Vance reached into his jacket pocket, retrieved a gold fountain pen, and signed the transfer authorization. I took the document back, verified the signature, and sent a 2-word text message to my team in Seattle: "Execute transfer." My phone chimed 30 seconds later, confirming the transaction. The digital ink was dry. Silas Vance was neutralized. More importantly, Vanguard Acquisitions now owned the sole debt obligation of Sterling Medical. I held the leash, and the collar was wrapped tightly around my brother's neck. I stood up, closing my briefcase. I suggest you book a flight to a country lacking an extradition treaty, Mr. Vance. I walked out of the brutalist skyscraper and stepped into a waiting car heading toward O'Hare International Airport. The sensation of victory was profound. My family had spent decades treating me as an afterthought, a convenient servant to clean up their failures. Now, legally and financially, I owned their entire legacy. I possessed the legal authority to walk into the Sterling Medical headquarters, trigger a default on the mezzanine loan, and seize control of the board. I arrived at the airport terminal and navigated through the chaotic evening crowds. I found a quiet corner in the first-class lounge, ordered a black coffee, and prepared to draft the foreclosure notice on my laptop. The plan was flawless. Julian had handed me the weapon, and I was going to use it to excise him from the company permanently. I opened my laptop, ready to strike the final blow. Then the ambient noise in the lounge seemed to fade. I glanced up at the large television monitor mounted above the bar. A breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen on a major financial news network. My hands stopped moving. The breath froze in my lungs. The screen displayed a live press conference taking place at the Seattle Chamber of Commerce. Julian stood at a podium wearing a pristine navy suit, smiling broadly for the flashing cameras. He looked the part of a visionary leader, radiating a toxic, unearned confidence. Richard stood just behind him, clapping his hands, beaming with paternal pride. I could not hear the audio over the noise of the airport, but I did not need to. The bold white text scrolling across the bottom of the screen delivered a devastating message. Sterling Medical newly appointed CEO announces intent to file for initial public offering. Company seeks to raise $200 million in public equity markets next quarter. I stared at the television, the cold reality of Julian's maneuver washing over me. He was not just incompetent, he was reckless to the point of criminality. Julian had pledged the entire company as collateral for a shadow loan just days ago. That meant the equity of Sterling Medical was technically encumbered. It belonged to the debt holder. To take a company public through an IPO, an executive must file a prospectus with the Securities and Exchange Commission, disclosing every liability and debt obligation. Julian was launching an IPO to raise cash from public investors to secretly pay off the mezzanine loan. He was trying to trap retail investors in his sinking ship. If Julian filed those public documents without disclosing the massive toxic loan, I now held it escalated his actions from poor management to felony securities fraud. He was preparing to defraud the federal government and the public markets. And the true horror of the situation crystallized in my mind. Richard was still the chairman of the board. His signature would be required on all federal filings. Julian was not just committing a crime, he was marching our father directly into a federal indictment. If that IPO paperwork was submitted, the regulatory agencies would destroy the family, and the resulting scandal would render the company worthless before I could even seize it. I closed my laptop, the screen snapping shut. The hunt was no longer a simple foreclosure. It had just become a race to stop a federal crime. The flight back to Seattle felt agonizingly slow. The quiet satisfaction of securing the mezzanine debt had been entirely eclipsed by the urgent threat of Julian's disastrous public offering. I spent the entire journey analyzing the regulatory implications of an initial public offering built on a foundation of hidden toxic loans. If Julian filed an S-1 registration statement with the Securities and Exchange Commission while concealing the mezzanine debt I now owned, he would be committing wire fraud, securities fraud, and making false statements to federal regulators. The penalties for those offenses carried mandatory minimum prison sentences. My objective had always been to remove my father and brother from leadership to seize control of the legacy they were mismanaging. I never intended to send them to a federal penitentiary. I landed at SeaTac Airport just as the city was waking up to a heavy, relentless drizzle. I bypassed my apartment and instructed the driver to head straight to a discreet location in Pioneer Square. Maya had sent a secure message while I was in the air requesting an urgent off-the-record meeting. She selected a subterranean speakeasy that did not open to the public until the evening. The owner owed Vanguard a favor, allowing us to use the dim, empty space for absolute privacy. I walked down the narrow brick-lined stairwell and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The air smelled of stale bourbon and damp stone. Maya sat in a corner booth illuminated only by a single wall sconce. She wore a trench coat over her tailored suit, her posture rigid, her expression guarded. She did not look like the composed corporate attorney who usually navigated high society galas. She looked like a woman preparing for a brutal extraction. I slid into the leather booth opposite her. "You look tense, Maya." She did not offer a greeting. She reached into her briefcase, pulled out a manila envelope, and slid it across the scarred wooden table. "Look at these." I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of financial documents. They were internal revenue projections and preliminary audit reports prepared for the upcoming initial public offering. I scanned the first page, my eyes darting over the figures. The numbers were wrong. They were spectacularly dangerously wrong. "Julian is inflating the projected revenue streams by nearly 40%, I said, setting the papers down. "He is inventing forward-looking contracts that do not exist to make the company look like a hyper-growth asset to retail investors. Keep reading." Maya instructed, her voice tight. "Look at the authorization signatures." I flipped to the final page of the audit report. There, confirming the validity of the fabricated financial projections, was the signature of the chairman of the board, Richard Sterling. I stared at the ink. The signature was a flawless replication of my father's distinct angular handwriting. But Richard, despite his immense ego and archaic business practices, was fiercely protective of his personal legal liability. He would never knowingly sign a document containing fabricated financial data intended for federal regulators. He was arrogant, not suicidal. "Julian forged his signature," I stated, looking up at Maya. The realization settled over me like a suffocating weight. My brother had crossed the line from gross incompetence into active, desperate criminality. Maya nodded, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and exhaustion. "Julian finalized the documents late last night while Richard was asleep. He plans to submit the preliminary filings to the underwriters by noon today. He believes the influx of public capital from the IPO will cover his tracks before anyone notices the discrepancies. He is trying to build a bridge while he is falling off a cliff. He is going to take Richard down with him," I said, tracing the forged signature with my finger. "When the SEC reviews these filings and discovers the revenue is a mirage, they will initiate a fraud investigation. The federal prosecutors will not care about family dynamics. They will see the chairman's signature on a fraudulent document. Richard will be indicted as a co-conspirator. He will face a federal prison sentence." Maya leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. "Julian is panicked. He knows the Mercy Hospital contract cancellation crippled the operating budget. He knows the mezzanine debt he signed requires a massive balloon payment he cannot make. He is cornered, and cornered men do not think about collateral damage. They only think about survival." I looked at the brilliant woman sitting across from me. She had spent years attempting to mold Julian into a respectable executive, investing her own legal acumen into his hollow ambitions. Now she was handing me the evidence of his imminent destruction. "Why are you giving this to me, Maya? You are his wife. You are bound by spousal privilege. You are also a partner at a law firm that could be implicated if they are attached to this IPO. I am giving this to you because I refuse to go down with his sinking ship." Maya replied, her voice cold and resolute. "I spent years trying to mitigate his stupidity, playing the supportive partner while he ignored my counsel. I will not allow his desperation to destroy my career and my freedom. I know you, Clara. I know you are not just a bookkeeper. You have a plan. I am providing you with the leverage to execute it, provided you keep my name out of the blast radius." I respected her pragmatism. She recognized a losing hand and was decisively folding her cards. I slid the documents back into the envelope. "I will stop the public offering. I will block the filings before they reach the underwriters." How Maya asked, her brow furrowing. "Julian controls the executive suite. Richard controls the board. You resigned. You possess no formal authority to halt an executive action." I picked up the envelope. "I do not need formal authority. I have acquired an alternative mechanism, but I cannot execute it immediately without exposing my position prematurely. I need time to orchestrate the disruption." I stood up from the booth. "Maya, you need to initiate your exit strategy. When the structural integrity of Sterling Medical fails, the resulting debris field will be extensive. File the paperwork. Protect your assets. Do not wait for him to confess." Maya offered a sharp, singular nod. She understood the directive. We parted ways in the subterranean bar, two women navigating the wreckage created by men who believed they were untouchable. I walked back up the brick stairwell and stepped out onto the damp Seattle street. The rain had intensified, washing the pavement in a gray, oppressive light. I needed to leverage my Vanguard network to anonymously flag the forged documents to the underwriting banks. A quiet, off-the-record tip from a reputable financial intelligence firm would be enough to spook the underwriters into delaying the IPO filings, buying me the necessary time to trigger the debt default and seize the company. I pulled my phone from my pocket to dial Victor. Before I could unlock the screen, the device vibrated violently in my hand. A barrage of notifications flooded the display. News alerts, text messages from former colleagues, and missed calls from industry contacts. I tapped the first news alert. It was a push notification from the Seattle Business Journal. The headline hit me with the force of a physical blow. Sterling Medical terminates senior finance executive citing gross negligence. Company prepares for major public offering. I clicked the link, reading the article as I stood on the rain-slicked sidewalk. Julian had not waited for noon. He had preemptively launched a vicious, calculated strike. The article quoted an official press release issued by Julian Sterling. He publicly announced that Clara Sterling had been formally terminated from her role in the finance department due to gross negligence and a severe failure to maintain fiduciary standards. The release claimed that my incompetence was the primary reason the company had struggled with recent cash flow issues, and that my removal was a necessary step to ensure the integrity of the upcoming initial public offering. Julian had weaponized the media against his own sister. He knew his fraudulent revenue projections and the forged signatures were a massive liability. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to blame if the regulators discovered the discrepancies before the public money arrived. He had constructed a narrative framing me as the architect of the financial instability, positioning himself as the decisive new leader who was cleaning up the mess. He was setting me up to take the fall for his impending federal crimes. My phone vibrated again. A text message from Richard. "You have disgraced this family for the last time. Do not attempt to contact us. You will speak only to our legal counsel." They had drawn a public battle line. They believed they had neutralized me, destroying my professional reputation to shield their own fraudulent maneuvers. They thought I would retreat shamed by the public termination, too intimidated to fight back. I stood in the rain reading the vitriolic text from the man who had always viewed me as an afterthought. A cold, absolute calm settled over me. The desire to simply seize the company shifted into a demand for total, undeniable eradication of their authority. I dialed Victor's private line. He answered immediately, likely already reading the same article. "We are changing the strategy," I told him, my voice devoid of any hesitation. "What is the play?" Victor asked. "I am not going to quietly delay the public offering," I said, watching the traffic pass on the gray street. "I am going to let them step onto the public stage. I am going to let them build their glass house. And then I am going to shatter it while the entire city watches. Get the media division ready. We are going to war." Julian's press release was intended to be an execution. In the corporate arena, reputation is currency, and he had just attempted to bankrupt mine. He expected me to hire a defense attorney, issue a frantic denial, or perhaps beg for a retraction. He operated on the assumption that I still cared about the Sterling name. He did not realize I had spent the last decade forging my own armor. I returned to the Vanguard headquarters. The trading floor hummed with the focused energy of a predator scenting blood. I bypassed my private office and walked directly into the communications division. The director, a sharp man named Elias, looked up from his terminal. He had the Seattle Business Journal article projected on the main wall. Elias asked if we were issuing a cease and desist. I shook my head. "A denial only creates a debate," I told him. "We do not defend, we amplify." I explained the psychology of the market. Wall Street analysts despise uncertainty. When a company preparing for an initial public offering abruptly terminates a senior finance executive citing gross negligence, it triggers every regulatory alarm bell in the financial district. Julian thought he was offering a scapegoat. In reality, he had just confessed to systemic financial instability right before asking the public for $200 million. Elias understood the assignment immediately. Vanguard maintained a vast, untraceable network of financial bloggers, short sellers, and industry pundits. We did not need to publish a lie. We merely needed to ask the right questions aloud. Within an hour, the counter-narrative took root. Prominent market commentators began tweeting about the glaring red flags at Sterling Medical. They questioned the timing of the termination. If the internal bookkeeping was compromised by gross negligence, how could any investor trust the upcoming prospectus? Broadcast anchors on prime financial networks picked up the thread. They debated whether the Securities and Exchange Commission would launch a preemptive audit. The consensus was unanimous. Sterling Medical was a toxic asset. The market reaction was instantaneous and brutal. Retail investors, those holding the minor fraction of publicly traded shares from a previous fractional offering years ago, panicked. The stock price plummeted. It did not just dip. It entered a freefall, shedding 20% of its value before the midday bell. Julian had effectively ignited his own house to burn a single piece of furniture. I left the trading floor and retreated to the quiet sanctuary of my office. I stood by the espresso machine, listening to the rhythmic grind of the dark roast beans. The rich, bitter aroma filled the space. The porcelain cup was warm against my palms. I took a slow sip, savoring the quiet efficiency of the unfolding chaos. My phone rang. The caller identification displayed my father's private cell phone number. The man who had texted me hours ago demanding I never contact the family was now breaking his own directive. I set my espresso on the glass desk and swiped to answer. I did not offer a greeting. "Clara!" Richard bellowed into the receiver. His voice lacked its usual commanding resonance. It was frayed, edged with a frantic, breathless panic. "What did you say to the press?" "I said nothing to the press, Richard," I replied, my tone neutral, unbothered by his escalating hysteria. Julian issued the statement. I merely allowed the financial sector to read it. "Do not play semantics with me," Richard shouted. "The underwriters are threatening to pull out of the public offering. The stock is a penny away from being delisted. My phone has not stopped ringing since the market opened. You are humiliating this family. You are destroying my legacy." I walked toward the window, looking out over the Seattle skyline. Julian humiliated the family the moment he authorized a fraudulent revenue projection, I stated calmly. You destroyed your own legacy the moment you allowed him to sit in the executive chair. "Listen to me very carefully," Richard demanded, shifting from anger to the paternal authority he had always used to force compliance. "You are going to draft a public apology. You will state that your termination was justified, that you suffered a mental breakdown, and that the core financials of Sterling Medical remain pristine. You will send it to the Business Journal within the hour, or I swear I will ruin you in this city." He wanted me to fall on my sword to protect the son who had just tried to ruin me. He expected the dutiful, invisible daughter to sacrifice her dignity to save his illusion of a perfect empire. It was the same dynamic that had defined my entire childhood, distilled into a single phone call. I took another sip of my espresso. The dark roast felt grounding. "You cannot ruin a person who holds the deed to your survival," Richard, I said. "I will not issue a retraction. I will not save your public offering. You and Julian are going to sit in the ashes of the fire you started." Before he could unleash another torrent of threats, I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the desk. The silence in my office was pristine. I felt no guilt, no residual loyalty. The emotional tether had been severed long ago. Now only the mechanics of the acquisition remained. While Richard was screaming into a deadline, and Julian was undoubtedly hiding in his new corner office, the Vanguard algorithms were executing the silent phase of the operation. The panic we engineered in the press had caused the retail investors to dump their minority shares en masse. They wanted out at any price. Vanguard was there to catch every single falling share. We utilized dark pools and automated trading bots, scooping up the discarded equity and microtransactions that masked the true volume of our purchasing power. To the outside observer, it looked like random market static. In reality, a coordinated vacuum was absorbing the fragmented pieces of Sterling Medical. I monitored the progress on my secondary terminal. The progress bar crept upward as the algorithms executed thousands of trades per second. The strategy was two-pronged. I already held the mezzanine debt, which gave me the power to foreclose if Julian defaulted. But buying the equity gave me immediate voting power inside the boardroom. If I could secure a majority equity stake, I could legally block the initial public offering vote from within, terminate the chief executive officer, and bypass the lengthy legal foreclosure process entirely. Victor knocked once and entered my office holding a digital tablet. The media blitz worked better than anticipated, he reported, his eyes scanning the data. The retail sell-off is staggering. The shareholders are treating the stock like a contagion. How much have we captured? I asked, keeping my gaze locked on the progress bar. Victor handed me the tablet. The screen displayed the Vanguard internal ledger. The number was significant, but not definitive. The system alert chimed a sharp, crystalline sound that echoed in the quiet room. A notification popped onto my main monitor. Vanguard Acquisitions now legally controlled 30% of the voting rights for Sterling Medical. We hold 30%, I said, digesting the figure. Victor crossed his arms. 30% gives you a loud voice at the table, Clara. But it is a minority voice. Richard and Julian still hold the remaining block of voting shares. They can outvote you. They can push the public offering through sheer numerical advantage. I need 51%, I stated, calculating the remaining shares available in the open market. I need the unassailable majority. I need the power to veto the public offering and dissolve the executive suite with a single motion. Victor glanced at his watch. You have a severe temporal constraint. The emergency board meeting to finalize the underwriter filings is scheduled for 9 o'clock on Thursday morning. The moment they ratify the prospectus, the Securities and Exchange Commission locks the capitalization table. The shares freeze. I looked at the digital calendar on my screen. The countdown was stark and uncompromising. I had exactly 48 hours to acquire the remaining 21% of the company. If I failed, Julian would file the fraudulent documents, the federal regulators would descend, and the empire would be incinerated before I could claim the throne. The trap was set, but the jaws had not yet snapped shut. I needed to find a way to bleed the remaining shares from the market, and I had only 2 days to orchestrate a mutiny. The 48-hour countdown required a surgical intervention. The retail investors had surrendered their shares, securing Vanguard a solid 30% block. However, the remaining equity necessary to achieve a majority was held tightly by private stakeholders who remained unswayed by public relations disasters. To break their grip, I needed to engineer a structural failure within the operational core of Sterling Medical. I needed the vendors to revolt. Julian, in his typical fashion, attempted to smother a financial crisis with social extravagance. Desperate to reassure his high-net-worth investors and crucial supply chain partners, before the emergency board meeting, he chartered a luxury yacht for an evening cruise on the Puget Sound. The event was billed as a sunset gala to celebrate the impending public offering. It was a transparent facade, a desperate attempt to project solvency, while the hull of his company took on water. I arrived at the Belle Harbor Marina just as the late afternoon sun began to dip behind the Olympic Mountains, casting a brilliant, deceptive golden light over the water. The yacht, a sleek multi-deck vessel, was moored at the end of the private dock. Catering staff carried trays of champagne and oysters on board, while a string quartet tuned their instruments on the upper deck. The guest list was exclusive, restricted to the vital arteries of the Sterling supply network. I did not possess an invitation. I did not require one. 5 years of managing the internal ledgers meant I knew the security protocols for these corporate charters intimately. I bypassed the main boarding ramp where Julian's assistants were checking names and utilized a service entrance near the catering loading zone. I wore a simple black cocktail dress, blending seamlessly into the crowd of affluent guests mingling near the stern. I carried a slim, dark leather portfolio. Inside were not weapons or threats, but numbers, cold, verifiable data. I navigated the crowded deck, my eyes scanning the faces of the corporate elite. I was not looking for Julian. I was hunting the apex predators of the medical supply chain. Within minutes, I located my targets gathered near the starboard railing. David Thorne, CEO of Apex Surgical Polymers, Sarah Lynn, managing partner of Biotech Distribution, and Marcus Vance, head of Global Med Logistics. These 3 individuals controlled 70% of the raw materials Sterling Medical required to manufacture its devices. Without their continued supply, the Sterling production lines would halt within a week. I approached their group, maintaining a deliberate, unhurried pace. I did not interrupt their conversation. I simply walked past them, maintaining a close proximity. As I brushed past Marcus Vance, I orchestrated a calculated stumble, a brief, seemingly accidental loss of balance. The leather portfolio slipped from my grasp, landing on the teak deck. The clasp sprang open. 3 distinct single-page documents spilled onto the polished wood, coming to rest directly at the feet of the 3 supply executives. I murmured a quick, embarrassed apology and bent down to retrieve the portfolio. I was slow, deliberately slow. David Thorne, a man whose entire career was built on assessing risk, instinctively glanced down at the documents before I could gather them. His eyes caught the bold red header on the top page: Sterling Medical Internal Liquidity Projection. Confidential. I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten as he processed the numbers displayed beneath the header. The document was a precise, unredacted financial forecast I had compiled before my departure. It detailed the exact cash reserves remaining after Julian's marketing expenditure and the catastrophic loss of the Mercy Hospital contract. It starkly illustrated that Sterling Medical lacked the liquid capital to fulfill its vendor invoices for the next 2 quarters. I snatched the documents from the deck, snapping the portfolio shut with a sharp click. I offered a final flustered smile and retreated into the crowd, disappearing toward the lower deck. I did not need to stay to witness the detonation. I knew exactly how these executives functioned. They were not loyal to the Sterling name. They were loyal to their profit margins. The realization that they were shipping millions of dollars in inventory to a company that could not pay them would override any champagne-fueled reassurance Julian offered. I positioned myself near a dark window on the lower deck, observing the scene above. The string quartet continued to play, but the atmosphere near the starboard railing had shifted from convivial to toxic. David Thorne was showing his phone to Sarah and Marcus, likely pulling up the public reports of the recent stock crash to corroborate the numbers he had just glimpsed. The 3 executives exchanged grim, urgent looks. The polite veneer of the gala vanished. They moved as a single predatory unit, cutting through the crowd toward the bow of the yacht where Julian was holding court. Julian stood near the captain's wheel, a glass of vintage champagne in hand, laughing loudly at a joke made by a minor investor. He looked the part of a successful heir, completely oblivious to the mutiny bearing down on him. David Thorne did not wait for an opening in the conversation. He stepped directly into Julian's personal space, his posture aggressive and unyielding. The laughter died in Julian's throat. The exchange was inaudible from my vantage point, but the body language was unmistakable. David was speaking in sharp, clipped sentences. Sarah stood beside him, her arms crossed, radiating hostility. Marcus leaned in, pointing a finger directly at Julian's chest. They were demanding answers. They were demanding the truth about the internal liquidity. Julian's confident facade crumbled instantly. He took a step back, his eyes darting around the deck, searching for Richard or Maya, anyone to shield him from the assault. But he was alone. The 3 supply barons cornered him against the railing. I watched Julian's mouth moving rapidly. He was likely spinning frantic lies, promising imminent capital from the upcoming public offering, begging for patience. But seasoned vendors do not accept promises of future wealth when current invoices are in jeopardy. David Thorne shook his head violently, slicing a hand through the air, dismissing Julian's excuses. He pulled out his phone, holding it up like a weapon. The message was clear: "Pay us now or the supply trucks turn around tomorrow morning." Julian was visibly panicking. The color had drained from his face. He was sweating despite the cool evening breeze off the water. If the vendors halted shipments, the manufacturing plants would shut down. The news would leak instantly to the market, and the public offering would be dead before the paperwork reached the underwriters. He needed to placate them immediately, regardless of the cost. Julian reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded document, waving it frantically at the 3 executives. He was speaking rapidly, pleading his case, gesturing to the paper as a lifeline. I smiled in the darkness of the lower deck. Julian believed he was offering them a temporary solution, a stopgap measure, to ensure the supply lines remained open until the IPO cash materialized. Earlier that day, Julian's legal team scrambled and, desperate, had drafted a series of emergency credit extension agreements for the major vendors. The agreements promised steep penalty interest rates if the invoices were not paid within 30 days, offering a lucrative incentive for the vendors to delay their collection demands. However, Julian's legal team was currently in disarray, distracted by the media fallout and the impending board meeting. They had outsourced the rapid drafting of the emergency agreements to a boutique contract firm in downtown Seattle. a boutique firm that, unbeknownst to Julian, was a silent subsidiary owned entirely by Vanguard Acquisitions. David Thorne snatched the document from Julian's hand. He scanned the terms, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. Sarah and Marcus leaned in, reading over his shoulder. The steep penalty interest rate was appealing. It offered a high return for a short delay, assuming Sterling Medical eventually paid. The three executives exchanged a tight, calculating glance. The panic subsided, replaced by greedy pragmatism. David pulled a pen from his breast pocket. He signed the agreement against the teak railing, followed quickly by Sarah and Marcus. Julian slumped against the side of the yacht, exhaling a massive, visible sigh of relief. He believed he had averted a catastrophe. He believed he had bought himself the necessary 48 hours to finalize the public offering. He took the signed documents back, tucking them into his jacket with trembling hands. I turned away from the window, the faint strains of the string quartet following me as I navigated towards the exit ramp. The trap was set, and Julian had just willingly secured his own restraints. He had not read the fine print. Desperate men rarely do. The emergency credit agreement contained a standard default clause outlining the penalties for missed payments. However, buried deep within the indemnification section, cloaked in dense, convoluted legal jargon drafted by Vanguard's top contract attorneys, was a specific trigger. It was known in aggressive corporate restructuring as a poison pill. The clause stipulated that any significant disruption to the personal asset structure of the chief executive officer would immediately classify the emergency vendor agreement as in default. It meant that if Julian's personal financial stability was threatened, the vendors had the legal right to demand immediate full payment of all outstanding invoices, bypassing the 30-day grace period entirely. Julian thought he had secured a lifeline. In reality, he had just handed the vendors the power to bankrupt the company instantly. All I needed to do now was ensure his personal asset structure experienced a spectacular, unavoidable disruption, and I knew exactly who was prepared to deliver the fatal blow. The morning after the yacht gala, Julian attempted to reclaim the narrative. The disastrous stock crash and the rumors of vendor instability had deeply unsettled the retail investors. To project an aura of control before the crucial board meeting, Julian scheduled a live interview on the Northwest Executive, a prominent regional business podcast renowned for its softball questions and sycophantic hosts. It was a calculated move to sanitize his image, a desperate broadcast of false confidence. I monitored the live stream from my office at Vanguard. Julian sat in the podcast studio wearing a crisp charcoal suit, projecting a relaxed, authoritative demeanor. He smiled easily, dismissing the recent market volatility as temporary turbulence associated with the upcoming public offering. He spun the departure of the senior finance executive as a necessary restructuring to streamline operations. He spoke of visionary leadership and the robust future of Sterling Medical. He was delivering the script he had rehearsed all his life. While Julian performed for the cameras, Maya was executing a far more substantial maneuver across town. Maya's tolerance for the Sterling family had eroded steadily over 5 years. She had endured Richard's thinly veiled condescension, his archaic views on corporate governance, and the subtle, persistent microaggressions that characterized his interactions with a successful black woman. She had tolerated Julian's infidelities, his intellectual laziness, and his constant need for validation. She viewed her marriage as a strategic partnership, a flawed but necessary alliance to elevate her own status within the conservative Seattle legal community. However, Julian's decision to forge Richard's signature on federal documents crossed the threshold from tolerable dysfunction into criminal liability. Maya recognized that the blast radius of Julian's impending indictment would inevitably scorch her own career. She was a partner at a top-tier law firm. She would not allow her hard-earned reputation to be collateral damage in the collapse of a mediocre dynasty. At exactly 10:15 in the morning, while Julian was eloquently describing his strategic vision on the podcast, Maya filed a petition for dissolution of marriage at the King County Superior Court. The petition was not a quiet, amicable separation. Maya, leveraging her formidable legal expertise, filed a fault-based divorce, citing irreconcilable differences compounded by financial malfeasance and dissipation of marital assets. She attached a preliminary injunction requesting an immediate freeze on all joint accounts and personal holdings to prevent Julian from hiding assets prior to the settlement phase. The filing was a tactical masterpiece designed for maximum disruption. But Maya's most lethal strike was her choice of legal representation. She did not hire a traditional family law attorney. She formally retained the Forensic Accounting Division of Vanguard Acquisitions to assess and divide the marital estate. By retaining Vanguard, Maya effectively granted my firm full legal authorization to scrutinize every aspect of Julian's personal financial structure, bypassing the corporate firewalls he had erected. We now possess the legal mandate to dissect his wealth. I watched the podcast stream on my primary monitor. The host, a man with a lacquered smile, leaned forward. Julian, the critics say, your aggressive expansion strategy is alienating your core suppliers. How do you respond to concerns about supply chain stability? Julian chuckled, a practiced sound of dismissal. The critics are operating on outdated information. Just last night, I personally secured extended credit agreements with our top 3 vendors. The supply chain is not just stable, it is fortified. We have the runway we need to execute the public offering. Sterling Medical has never been stronger. The notification flashed on my secondary screen. The King County Superior Court clerk had processed the filing. The injunction was active. I picked up my phone and dialed the producer of the Northwest Executive podcast. The number was listed on their public directory. The producer answered, his voice hushed to avoid bleeding into the live broadcast. I am Clara Sterling, I said, my tone urgent and authoritative. I am a senior executive at Vanguard Acquisitions. You need to interrupt the broadcast immediately. A major legal development concerning your guest has just been filed in Superior Court. Continuing the interview without addressing it will severely compromise your journalistic integrity. The producer hesitated, the ingrained instinct to protect a high-profile guest, warring with the fear of missing a breaking scandal. What development? Julian Sterling's assets have just been frozen by a court order pursuant to a hostile divorce filing, I stated clearly. He is currently misrepresenting his financial solvency to your audience. If you allow him to continue soliciting investment while under a financial injunction, your network could be implicated in promoting securities fraud. The line went silent for 3 seconds. Then I heard the frantic typing of a keyboard. The producer was verifying the court docket. On the live stream, the host was nodding along to Julian's continued monologue about corporate synergy. Suddenly, the host's earpiece visibly crackled. He paused, his smile faltering as he listened to the producer's frantic instructions. Julian, oblivious to the shift in the room, continued speaking. The key to navigating crisis is maintaining a steady hand at the wheel. You have to project strength when the market expects weakness. The host cleared his throat, interrupting Julian mid-sentence. Julian, we are receiving some breaking news right now regarding your personal financial status. We are getting reports that a petition for divorce has been filed this morning by your wife, Maya Sterling, accompanied by an emergency injunction freezing your personal assets. Can you comment on how this might impact the stability of Sterling Medical? Julian froze. The polished veneer shattered instantly. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The camera captured the exact moment the realization hit him. The public facade of the steady executive dissolved into genuine, unfiltered panic. He stared at the host, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. I am Julian, stammered, his voice weak and trembling. I am not aware of any such filing. This is a private matter. We are here to discuss the company. The host, sensing blood in the water, pressed the advantage. But Julian, the injunction freezes your personal shares in Sterling Medical. If your equity is locked in litigation, does that not fundamentally alter the capitalization structure you just assured our audience was secure? Julian abruptly stood up, knocking his microphone off the desk. The sharp feedback squeal echoed through the stream. He did not offer an excuse or a closing statement. He simply turned and fled the studio, the live camera tracking his frantic exit, until he disappeared through the heavy, soundproof doors. The podcast incident was a public humiliation, but the true devastation was unfolding within the legal architecture I had constructed. The emergency injunction granted to Maya achieved exactly what I needed. It legally immobilized Julian's personal wealth. He could not sell, transfer, or leverage his shares in Sterling Medical. His personal asset structure had experienced a significant, undeniable disruption. The condition for the poison pill had been met. I turned away from the live stream and opened the secure communications channel to my legal team. The trap was sprung. Notify David Thorne, Sarah Lynn, and Marcus Vance, I instructed the lead attorney. Inform them that the chief executive officer of Sterling Medical is currently under a financial injunction. The default clause in their emergency credit agreements is now active. They have the legal right to demand immediate full payment of all outstanding invoices. Within 15 minutes, the 3 supply executives executed their rights. They issued formal demand letters to Sterling Medical calling in debts totaling nearly $12 million due immediately. Julian, whose personal assets were frozen and whose corporate operating fund was empty, could not meet the demands. Sterling Medical was officially insolvent. The vendors immediately filed notices of default with the corporate credit agencies. The downgrade was instantaneous. The remaining institutional confidence evaporated. Sterling Medical was no longer a viable entity preparing for a public offering. It was a distressed asset teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. And I held the mezzanine debt, the shadow loan Julian had secured by pledging the entire company as collateral. The default on the vendor invoices triggered a cross-default clause in the mezzanine loan agreement. Julian's failure to maintain operational solvency gave Vulture Capital and, by extension, Vanguard Acquisitions the immediate right to accelerate the loan and demand repayment in full. I drafted the formal notice of acceleration. I did not send it to Julian. I sent it directly to Richard Sterling, the chairman of the board. I wanted the man who built the empire to witness its collapse firsthand. I pressed send. The email delivered the fatal blow. Sterling Medical owed Vanguard Acquisitions $45 million payable immediately. If the debt was not settled by the opening of the emergency board meeting the next morning, Vanguard possessed the legal authority to foreclose on the collateral, seizing the 60% voting block Julian held and claiming total ownership of the company. The kingdom was mine. I merely needed to wait for the morning to claim the crown. The email was sent. The trap was locked. I spent the remainder of the evening finalizing the legal exhibits required for the morning board meeting. The transition of power requires meticulous documentation, and I intended to leave no procedural vulnerabilities. I anticipated a quiet night, a brief respite before the final execution of the Sterling legacy. Elias, the director of communications for Vanguard, shattered that expectation. He did not knock. He pushed through the glass doors of my office holding a digital tablet. His usual sharp composure had fractured. He bypassed the customary greetings and placed the screen directly on my desk. A prominent financial tabloid notorious for breaking corporate scandals with reckless disregard for verification had just published an exclusive feature. The headline ran in stark, bold lettering across the top of the webpage. Vanguard partner Clara Sterling implicated in charity embezzlement scandal. The article alleged that during my tenure as the executor of my late mother's estate, I had systematically siphoned funds designated for a pediatric oncology foundation. It claimed I diverted the capital into shell companies to finance my early career investments. Embedded within the text were high-resolution images of bank transfers and ledger entries bearing my forged signature. The narrative was engineered with surgical precision. It painted me not as a shrewd corporate strategist, but as a parasite who stole from dying children to build her wealth. I recognized the tactic. It was an act of profound desperation. Julian knew he could not defeat me in a boardroom or a courtroom. He lacked the capital and the intellect. So, he targeted the only currency Vanguard valued higher than profit: reputation. If I became radioactive, Vanguard would disavow me. The acquisition would stall, and Julian would gain the necessary time to find a new buyer for his worthless equity. The internal phone lines on my desk illuminated in rapid succession. Victor summoned me to the secure conference room on the top floor. When I entered, the atmosphere was rigid. Victor sat at the head of a long table flanked by the firm's chief compliance officer and the head of legal risk. Vanguard operated in the shadows of the financial sector, but we relied on maintaining a pristine regulatory record. Accusations of charity fraud invite immediate scrutiny from the Department of Justice and the Internal Revenue Service. Victor did not offer a seat. He pointed to the article projected on the wall monitor. "The optics are untenable, Clara," he stated, his tone devoid of our usual camaraderie. "Institutional investors are already calling. They see a lead partner accused of stealing from a memorial foundation. We cannot proceed with a hostile takeover of a medical company while you are fighting embezzlement charges in the court of public opinion. I met his gaze, evenly refusing to display a fraction of the betrayal simmering beneath my calm exterior. The documents are crude forgeries, I said. My mother established that foundation, and I have managed it with immaculate precision. The bank routing numbers in those screenshots do not even align with the foundation's actual financial institution. This is a manufactured crisis designed to freeze our timeline. The compliance officer adjusted his glasses, consulting a printed dossier. The market does not care about truth, Clara. It cares about risk. Until this is definitively disproven, you represent a severe liability to this firm. Victor delivered the final verdict. You have until midnight. Find the origin of the leak. Provide irrefutable evidence of the forgery. If you fail, the Compliance Committee will mandate a suspension of your partnership status pending an external audit. The Sterling acquisition will be placed on an indefinite hold. I turned and walked back to my office. The feeling of betrayal was secondary to the cold necessity of solving the problem. Julian had weaponized the memory of our mother. He had crossed a boundary that demanded an unmerciful response. I bypassed the public relations team. Drafting a denial would only validate the accusation and feed the media frenzy. I needed a digital executioner. I summoned Owen, the head of Vanguard's Cybersecurity and Intelligence Division. Owen was a former defense contractor who viewed the internet as a permeable membrane, a landscape of vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. He entered my office silent and efficient, carrying a heavy encrypted laptop. I directed his attention to the fabricated documents embedded in the article. The tabloid received these files from an anonymous source, I told him, pacing behind my desk. The journalist likely received a secure email containing a link to a dead drop server. I do not care about the journalist. I need the origin point of the data upload. I need the digital fingerprint of the person who created these forgeries. Owen nodded. He connected his machine to my network and initiated a trace. The process of unmasking an anonymous source requires penetrating layers of encrypted routing protocols. Owen worked with mechanical focus. He isolated the metadata embedded within the PDF files published by the tabloid. Forgers often focus on altering the visible text, neglecting the hidden digital history imprinted by the software used to create the document. Minutes stretched into an agonizing hour. I stood by the window watching the city lights blur in the persistent Seattle rain. The tension in the building was palpable. The Vanguard acquisition machinery remained paused, waiting for my authorization or my dismissal. I replayed the timeline of the forgery in my mind. Julian was careless. He lacked the meticulous attention to detail required to fabricate realistic financial ledgers. The formatting of the fake bank statements resembled an older accounting system, a legacy software the company abandoned years ago. Finally, Owen ceased typing. He turned his laptop toward me, his expression grave. The source utilized a virtual private network to mask their location. Owen explained, tracing a line of code on the screen with a pen. However, they compiled the forged PDFs using an outdated version of accounting software. That specific software attempts an automatic license verification ping every time a document is exported. The ping bypassed the secure tunnel and registered on the software developer's open server. We extracted the true Internet Protocol address from that verification log. Owen highlighted a sequence of numbers on the black screen. I recognized the format. It was a dedicated static address, typical of high-end residential networks, not a commercial office building or a public coffee shop. Run the geographic correlation, I commanded, leaning over his shoulder. I want the physical address tied to that network. I expected the trace to point to Julian's luxury condominium in downtown Seattle. I expected to find my brother huddled behind a keyboard, engineering a final pathetic defense to save his crumbling position. The system processed the query, accessing public utility registries and Internet service provider databases. The physical address materialized on the screen. The air in my office grew heavy, freezing the breath in my chest. The origin point did not belong to Julian. The digital fingerprint traced directly to the secure network at the Sterling family estate on Mercer Island. The specific device identifier matched a desktop computer located in the private study of Richard Sterling. My father had not just watched his son launch a smear campaign. The patriarch of the family had personally forged documents to frame his own daughter for stealing from his dead wife, all to protect the fragile ego of the son who was destroying his empire. The revelation that my father orchestrated the smear campaign severed the final tenuous thread of familial obligation. I instructed Owen to package the IP trace, the metadata analysis, and the undeniable proof of the forgery into a secure encrypted dossier. I forwarded this comprehensive evidence to Vanguard's Compliance Committee. The review was brief. The threat to my professional standing evaporated instantly, replaced by a renewed mandate from Victor to execute the acquisition with maximum prejudice. The Vanguard machinery hummed back to life, waiting for my signal. The morning light broke over Seattle, gray and unforgiving. The financial markets opened, and the reality of Julian's cascading failures finally impacted the ticker tape. The news of the vendor default, combined with the frozen personal assets resulting from Maya's divorce filing, triggered a catastrophic sell-off. Institutional investors who had hesitated the previous day now dumped their holdings aggressively. Sterling Medical stock did not just crash, it flatlined. The shares, once the bedrock of the family fortune, were now trading for pennies. I sat in my office watching the terminal. The destruction of the equity value was the precursor to a far more personal financial reckoning. When executives leverage their corporate shares to secure personal lines of credit, they enter a dangerous agreement with their banks. If the value of the underlying stock falls below a certain threshold, the bank issues a margin call. It is a ruthless demand for immediate cash to cover the depreciated value of the collateral. If the cash is not provided, the bank seizes the shares and liquidates them at market value, erasing the executive's ownership entirely. Richard Sterling had spent decades utilizing his company stock as a personal ATM. He had pledged significant blocks of shares to finance real estate acquisitions, luxury vehicles, and high-risk investments. With the stock price now decimated, his lenders were calling due. At precisely 9:15, the secure line on my desk chimed. The caller ID displayed the main number for the Sterling estate on Mercer Island. I answered, bypassing a greeting. Clara. Richard's voice lacked its usual booming authority. It sounded hollow, strained by panic and the suffocating pressure of impending ruin. I need you to listen to me very carefully. The situation has become critical. The investment bank just issued a margin call on my primary credit facility. They are demanding $5 million in liquid capital by noon. I maintained absolute silence. I wanted to hear the patriarch, the man who had dismissed me as a mere bookkeeper, struggle to articulate his desperation. He had attempted to frame me for embezzlement 12 hours ago. Now he was begging for financial salvation. Julian is unreachable. Richard continued, the frustration bleeding through his facade. His accounts are locked by that vindictive lawyer he married. The corporate operating fund is frozen due to the vendor disputes. The bank is threatening to seize the estate and liquidate my remaining shares. If they sell, the family loses control of the board. Everything I built will be gone. He paused, gathering his breath, attempting to resurrect a semblance of command. I know you have access to capital, Clara. You managed the external accounts before your departure. I need a short-term bridge loan, $5 million wired directly to the holding account. Consider it an investment in your heritage. An investment in a legacy built on fraud and incompetence, I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the satisfaction coursing through my veins. You require $5 million to prevent the bank from repossessing your house, and you expect me to provide it. Richard coughed, a dry, uncomfortable sound. In return for your assistance during this liquidity crunch, I am prepared to offer you a formal position on the executive team, Executive Vice President of Internal Operations. It is a significant title bump. You will report directly to Julian, of course, but it grants you a seat at the table. It is a generous offer, Clara, a chance to prove your worth to this family. The audacity was staggering. He was offering me a subordinate title, a position serving the man who had just destroyed the company in exchange for a $5 million bailout. He still viewed me as an obedient subordinate eager for crumbs of validation. He genuinely believed a meaningless title would compel me to rescue his sinking ship. I leaned back in my leather chair. I looked at the encrypted dossier containing the evidence of his forgery resting on the corner of my desk. You misunderstand your position. Richard, I stated, my tone devoid of emotion. You are not offering me a seat at the table. You are begging me to buy the table so you do not lose your chair. "Clara, do not test my patience." He snapped, a flash of his old arrogance returning. "This is not a negotiation. This is family business. Wire the funds." I recalled the dinner at the steakhouse. I recalled the cheap paper envelope and the dismissive laugh. "I am sorry, Dad," I said, allowing a slow, deliberate pause to emphasize the finality of the statement. "But as you clearly established during the succession dinner, I lack the predatory instinct required for real business. I am just a reliable clerk who gets lost in spreadsheets. I simply do not have the business material to execute a $5 million bridge loan." The silence on the line was profound. It was the sound of a man recognizing the total collapse of his authority. "Clara, you cannot be serious," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. "You would let the bank take the house. You would let the family lose the company. You lost the company the moment you handed it to Julian," I replied. "Enjoy the margin call." I severed the connection. I placed the phone gently on the desk. The time for maneuvering was over. The board meeting was scheduled to begin in 24 hours, but the execution required immediate structural changes. I shifted my focus to the primary terminal. The Vanguard legal team had prepared the final necessary documentation overnight. I opened the secure portal linked to Vulture Capital. The mezzanine debt I had acquired contained a critical provision standard in predatory lending contracts, but lethal when utilized correctly. It allowed the debt holder, upon a verified event of default, to convert the outstanding principal and accrued interest directly into common voting shares of the company, bypassing the public market entirely. Julian had defaulted on the vendor agreements. The vendor default triggered the cross-default clause in the mezzanine loan. The legal conditions were perfectly aligned. The trap was ready to snap shut. I navigated to the execution interface. The prompt asked for confirmation to initiate the debt-to-equity conversion protocol. This action would instantly dilute the existing shares, wiping out Richard and Julian's remaining equity value and issuing massive new blocks of voting shares directly to Vanguard Acquisitions. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a trace of remorse for the men who had built an empire on arrogance and attempted to destroy me to protect their fragile egos. They had weaponized my loyalty, mocked my competence, and forged documents to ruin my name. Now they would face the consequences of their arrogance. I pressed the Enter key. The system processed the command. The progress bar filled instantly. A digital confirmation receipt materialized on the screen. The financial alchemy was complete. The debt was converted. The shares were issued. The ownership structure of Sterling Medical was permanently, irrevocably altered. Vanguard Acquisitions now controlled a commanding, unassailable majority block of the voting rights. The company belonged to me. The only task remaining was to deliver the news in person. The debt-to-equity conversion solidified my absolute control over the capitalization table. The emergency board meeting scheduled for the following morning would merely serve as the formal execution chamber. However I required a public venue to definitively dismantle the facade Julian was still desperately attempting to maintain. He was a creature of optics, and his destruction needed to be broadcast to the very audience he sought to impress. The annual Medical Association Gala provided the perfect stage. Held at the Seattle Convention Center, it was the premier networking event for hospital administrators, regional politicians, and senior executives from every major medical supplier in the Pacific Northwest. Julian, despite the catastrophic market performance and the freezing of his personal assets, had refused to cancel his keynote address. He clung to the delusion that a charismatic speech could overwrite the reality of insolvency. I arrived at the convention center shortly after 8 o'clock, entering through the private loading dock utilized by the event production staff. The Vanguard Intelligence Division had secured the necessary access credentials hours prior. I wore a tailored black evening gown, an outfit designed to project authority rather than attract attention. I did not mingle in the grand ballroom. I proceeded directly to the technical control booth overlooking the main stage. The control booth was dark, illuminated only by the glow of the audio mixing boards and the massive video projection monitors. 2 technicians sat at the consoles monitoring the live feed of the gala below. They looked up, startled by my intrusion. Before they could articulate a protest, Victor stepped out from the shadows near the doorway. He handed the lead technician a sealed document bearing the insignia of the venue management company. Vanguard Acquisitions, has assumed primary sponsorship of tonight's keynote presentation. Victor stated, his tone brooking no argument. You are instructed to yield control of the audio-visual feed to my associate immediately. The technicians, recognizing the shift in corporate authority, quickly gathered their belongings and vacated the booth. I took the seat at the primary console, resting my hands lightly on the mixing board. The view of the ballroom was panoramic. Below, hundreds of guests sat at circular tables finishing their dinners, oblivious to the shift in power occurring above them. At 8:30 precisely, the Master of Ceremonies took the stage and introduced the keynote speaker, the new Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Medical. Julian walked onto the stage. He wore a tuxedo that fit immaculately, but his physical demeanor betrayed his internal panic. He was sweating profusely, the harsh stage lights reflecting off his forehead. He gripped the edges of the acrylic podium with white-knuckled intensity. He looked like a man standing on the gallows trying to convince the executioner he was merely inspecting the rope. "Thank you," Julian began, his voice strained, lacking its usual performative resonance. "Thank you for welcoming me tonight. We are entering a transformative era for Sterling Medical." I watched him from the booth, tracking his desperate attempt to reconstruct a narrative that had already collapsed. Despite the recent orchestrated market volatility, Julian continued forcing a tight, unconvincing smile. "The core fundamentals of our enterprise remain stronger than ever. We are moving forward with aggressive expansion plans. The upcoming initial public offering will provide the necessary capital to revolutionize our supply chain and deliver unprecedented value to our partners in this room." He was lying to the faces of the people he needed most. He was promising stability while his bank accounts were frozen and his equity was diluted to nothing. He was attempting to solicit investment based on fraudulent projections. It was time to end the performance. I reached forward and pulled down the master audio fader on the mixing board. Julian's microphone cut out mid-sentence. His voice vanished, replaced by the ambient hum of the confused audience. He tapped the microphone, a sharp, hollow sound echoing slightly across the stage. He looked toward the wings, gesturing frantically to the event staff, assuming a technical malfunction. The audience began to murmur, a collective ripple of unease spreading through the ballroom. I turned my attention to the video projection console. The massive screen behind Julian currently displayed the Sterling Medical logo, a crisp blue corporate crest. I accessed the override protocol and initiated the prepared visual sequence. The screen behind Julian flickered violently, cutting to black. A collective gasp rose from the audience. Then a new image materialized, projected in stark blood-red typography across a minimalist black background. The text was massive, unavoidable, dominating the entire visual field of the ballroom. "Hostile takeover executed. Sterling Medical, now a wholly owned subsidiary of Vanguard Acquisitions." The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating shock. Then the silence shattered. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Executives stood up from their tables, pointing at the screen. Cell phones materialized instantly as attendees began recording the unprecedented disruption. The murmur escalated into a roar of frantic conversation. The people Julian had just lied to now possessed undeniable proof of his deception. Julian spun around, finally noticing the immense red text dominating the screen behind him. He stared at the words, his face draining of color. The realization struck him with physical force. He staggered backward, gripping the podium to prevent himself from collapsing. The public offering was dead. His authority was obliterated. His humiliation was complete broadcast to the entire industry. He did not attempt to address the crowd. He abandoned the podium and bolted toward the stage-left exit, desperate to escape the glare of the spotlight and locate the control booth to terminate the feed. I watched him run, a fleeting shadow darting into the backstage darkness. He believed he could still find an operative, someone to bribe or threaten into restoring his presentation. He believed he still possessed agency. I leaned back in the chair, watching the chaotic scene unfold below. The operation was entering its final phase. Julian had fled the stage, but he was running into a confined space. I picked up the secure radio headset, linking me to the Vanguard security detail I had positioned throughout the venue. "Target has entered the stage-left corridor," I instructed, my voice calm amid the noise bleeding through the glass of the control booth. "Secure the perimeter. No one leaves." Julian navigated the labyrinthine backstage corridors, his tuxedo jacket flapping open, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He bypassed the empty dressing rooms and charged toward the primary electrical junction box, intending to manually cut the power to the projection system. He rounded a sharp corner, his hand outstretched, reaching for the heavy metal handle of the breaker panel. He stopped abruptly, his momentum carrying him forward a few awkward steps before he regained his balance. The corridor was not empty. The venue's typical event security personnel, usually recognizable by their bright yellow windbreakers, were entirely absent. In their place stood a line of men wearing dark, impeccably tailored suits. They possessed the stillness of professionals who did not require weapons to project intimidation. They formed a solid, unyielding barricade, completely blocking access to the electrical panel and the service elevator beyond. Julian stared at them, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with confusion and rising terror. "Excuse me," Julian demanded, attempting to summon his diminished executive authority. "I am the keynote speaker. You need to move aside immediately. I need access to that panel." The men did not shift. They did not acknowledge his title. They remained perfectly still, a wall of dark fabric and cold stares. The lead security operative, a man with a scarred jawline and a distinctly military bearing, stepped slightly forward. He did not raise his voice, but the tone was definitive, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Orders from Vanguard, sir." The operative stated, his expression impassive. "You are instructed to remain in the holding area until the transition is complete. Please do not attempt to proceed further." The visual display at the gala functioned perfectly as a psychological decapitation. Julian had been confined to a holding room by Vanguard security for the remainder of the event, stripped of his communications devices, forced to listen to the muted roar of the industry dissecting his public ruin. He was released only after the ballroom emptied, ensuring his departure was as humiliating as his presentation. The narrative was cemented. Sterling Medical was conquered territory. I returned to my penthouse in Bellevue shortly after midnight. The rain had ceased, leaving the city enveloped in a cold, damp stillness. I poured a glass of robust red wine, a vintage reserved for significant milestones, and stood by the expansive windows overlooking the darkened skyline. The acquisition was technically complete, secured by the debt conversion, but the final brutal severance of familial authority remained. They would not surrender quietly. They required a confrontation to understand the absolute finality of their defeat. At exactly 2 a.m, the heavy oak door of my apartment shuddered under a series of violent, frantic impacts. The sound was harsh, jarring against the quiet elegance of the space. I did not flinch. I had anticipated this desperate final charge. I set my wine glass on the marble island, walked to the entryway, and disabled the security lock. I pulled the door open. Richard and Julian stood in the corridor, their appearances a stark contrast to the polished executives they pretended to be. Julian's tuxedo was rumpled, his bow tie hanging loose, his face flushed and glistening with a cold sweat. Richard looked older than his 68 years, his usual rigid posture sagging, his eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged rage. "You psychotic bitch!" Julian lunged forward, attempting to push past me into the apartment. I did not yield. I held my ground in the doorway, my stance unwavering. "If you cross this threshold uninvited, Julian, I will have building security physically remove you. And given your current public standing, I imagine the police would be highly interested in a trespassing charge." Julian halted, his forward momentum checked by the cold reality of my threat. He stood inches from me, vibrating with a chaotic, impotent fury. Richard shoved Julian aside, stepping forward to assume command. His face was a mask of furious indignation. "Clara, what have you done? You orchestrated that spectacle at the gala. You hijacked the presentation. You are attempting to steal the company." "I did not steal anything, Richard," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of any reactionary heat. "I purchased the debt your son carelessly acquired. I executed the legal provisions he agreed to. The company belongs to Vanguard Acquisitions now. You engaged in corporate sabotage." Richard's voice rose, echoing in the quiet hallway. "You manipulated the market. You engineered the vendor default. I am contacting my attorneys immediately. We will file an injunction in federal court by sunrise. We will sue you for tortious interference fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. You will spend the next decade buried in litigation, and when I am finished, you will not even own the clothes on your back." He was projecting strength, utilizing the legal threats that had intimidated rivals throughout his career. He believed the threat of federal litigation would force a negotiation, a settlement that would allow him to salvage a fragment of his empire. He still believed he possessed leverage. I turned away from the door, leaving it open, and walked back toward the kitchen island. I picked up my wine glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to follow me into the stark, modern space of my apartment. They stepped inside cautiously, the environment unfamiliar and intimidating. "You cannot sue a firm for executing a legal contract," Richard, they said, turning to face them. "Vanguard operated entirely within the boundaries of established financial law. Your son, however, did not." I reached for a thick, unmarked brown envelope resting beside my wine glass. I picked it up and tossed it casually across the marble surface. It slid to a halt near the edge, stopping directly in front of Julian. "Open it," I commanded. Julian stared at the envelope, a sudden palpable hesitation replacing his aggressive posture. He reached out with trembling fingers, broke the seal, and pulled out the contents. He extracted a stack of documents. The top page was a copy of the Internal Revenue projections prepared for the initial public offering. The numbers were the fabricated figures Maya had provided. He flipped the page, his eyes landing on the final sheet. There, stark and undeniable, was the forged signature of Richard Sterling. Julian's breath hitched. His eyes darted from the paper to me, wide with a sudden suffocating panic. "You were preparing to submit those documents to the Securities and Exchange Commission," I stated, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You falsified revenue streams to secure public investment. That is securities fraud, Julian. It is a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence. And you forged the chairman's signature to authenticate it." Richard snatched the papers from Julian's hand. He scanned the forged signature, his face draining of color. He recognized the implications instantly. His son had not just ruined the company, he had exposed the patriarch to severe criminal liability. "Julian, you idiot!" Richard hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying blend of rage and fear. "What did you do?" Julian backed away from his father, his hands raised defensively. "I had to, Dad. The Mercy contract fell through. We needed the IPO cash. I was trying to save us." I picked up the remaining document from the Marble Island, a single sheet of paper containing the digital analysis provided by Owen's cybersecurity team. I held it up, ensuring Richard could clearly see the data. "And you, Richard," I continued, my gaze locking onto my father. "You decided to protect this criminal enterprise by launching a smear campaign against your own daughter. You leaked fabricated documents accusing me of embezzling from Mom's memorial fund." Richard stiffened, attempting to maintain a facade of denial. "I do not know what you are talking about. I had nothing to do with that article." I placed the paper on the island. "The digital fingerprint is undeniable. Vanguard Cybersecurity traced the IP address of the source upload directly to the private network in your study on Mercer Island. We have the exact timestamp, the device identifier, and the routing protocols. You personally engineered a character assassination to frame me." The silence that descended upon the apartment was absolute. The aggressive posturing, the threats of federal litigation, the arrogant entitlement, it all evaporated, replaced by a cold, paralyzing terror. They were no longer the powerful executives of Sterling Medical. They were two men staring down the barrel of federal indictments and public ruin, their survival entirely dependent on the woman they had spent a lifetime degrading. Richard lowered his head, the document slipping from his grasp to scatter across the floor. He looked diminished, a hollow shell of the patriarch he had pretended to be. "Clara," he whispered, the fight completely gone from his voice. "Please, we are family. Do not do this." I finished the remaining wine in my glass, the dark liquid coating my throat. I set the glass down with a definitive ringing clink against the marble. I looked at the digital clock displayed on the kitchen appliance panel. The red numbers glared brightly in the dim room. It was 2:30 in the morning. "The emergency board meeting is scheduled for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," I announced, my tone crisp and unforgiving. "You will both attend. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will comply with every directive Vanguard issues. If you hesitate, if you attempt to negotiate, I will hand these files to the federal prosecutor waiting in the lobby." I turned my back on them, walking toward the hallway leading to my bedroom. Remember to dress nicely, I added over my shoulder, not bothering to check if they were following. It is important to look presentable at your own execution. The air inside the Sterling Medical boardroom was always thick with a specific kind of arrogance. It smelled of expensive leather stale coffee, and the unspoken agreement that the men in this room were untouchable. At 8:55 on Thursday morning, that arrogance had curdled into a palpable, frantic anxiety. I monitored the room through the internal security feed accessed on my tablet, standing in the executive corridor just out of sight. Richard sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. He wore his darkest suit, attempting to project the formidable authority that had defined his career. But his posture was defensive, his shoulders hunched, his hands clasped tightly together, resting on the polished wood. Julian sat to his right, looking distinctly unwell. The flushed, sweaty panic from the previous night had settled into a pallid, exhausted dread. He kept glancing toward the heavy glass doors, anticipating the impending arrival. Surrounding them were the 5 remaining members of the board of directors. These men were relics of Richard's era, chosen for their loyalty rather than their business acumen. They were golf partners, college fraternity brothers, and retired executives from aligned industries. They had reliably rubber-stamped every decision Richard presented for 2 decades. Currently, they were engaged in hushed, urgent conversations. The news of the disastrous gala presentation and the sudden aggressive media reports regarding the Vanguard takeover had reached them early that morning. Richard, desperate to maintain a facade of control, had undoubtedly convened them with a fabricated narrative framing Vanguard as a rogue entity attempting an illegal maneuver. He was likely relying on their historic loyalty to force a unified vote, a desperate attempt to invalidate my actions and reclaim the narrative before the markets opened. They believed they were assembling to swat away an irritating mosquito. They did not comprehend they were sitting in the blast radius of a corporate detonation. I handed the tablet to Victor, who stood beside me, radiating a cold, predatory anticipation. "It is time," I stated. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. The low hum of anxious conversation ceased instantly. 7 heads turned simultaneously, tracking my entrance. For 5 years I had entered this room only when summoned, carrying binders of financial reports, wearing muted colors designed to render me invisible. I had sat in the small, uncomfortable chairs positioned along the wall, a silent scribe taking notes while the men debated the future of the company. I was no longer wearing beige. I wore a tailored crimson power suit. The cut was sharp, unapologetic, an architectural statement of authority. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, a steady, rhythmic sound that cut through the silence like a metronome, ticking down to an execution. I did not look at the guest chairs along the wall. I did not glance at Julian. I walked the length of the room, my gaze fixed entirely on the head of the table. Richard watched my approach, his eyes widening. He instinctively leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table, preparing to assert his dominance to order me to my designated place. He opened his mouth, the familiar condescending tone forming in his throat. "Clara," he began, his voice attempting its usual booming resonance. "You are out of line. Take a seat at the back. We are in the middle of an emergency session." I did not break my stride. I reached the head of the table and stopped directly beside his chair. I looked down at him, my expression devoid of any familial deference. "You are sitting in my chair, Richard," I said. The volume was low, but the command was absolute. Richard's mouth snapped shut. The command delivered with such casual certainty short-circuited his rehearsed outrage. He looked around the table, seeking validation from his loyal board members, expecting them to voice their indignation at my insubordination. The board members remained silent, their eyes darting between me and Richard, sensing a shift in the atmosphere they could not yet define. I placed my briefcase on the table, the metallic snap of the clasps echoing sharply. "I am not a guest," I continued, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I am the majority shareholder of this corporation, and I am convening this meeting." Julian, sitting rigidly to Richard's right, reached for his coffee mug with trembling hands. He brought the porcelain to his lips, attempting to mask his terror with a sip of cold coffee. As he tilted the mug, the heavy glass doors at the back of the boardroom swung open again. 4 individuals entered the room. They were not wearing the standard corporate attire typical of Vanguard analysts. They wore stark black suits, earpieces discreetly coiled behind their necks. They possessed the physical presence of a tactical unit, their movements synchronized and efficient. They were the Vanguard Executive Security Detail. Two of the operatives positioned themselves flanking the glass doors, their stances wide, their expressions impassive. The remaining two walked swiftly to the secondary exit near the catering station, mirroring the formation. The lead operative, the man with the scarred jawline who had contained Julian at the gala, stepped forward. He did not address the board. He reached out and engaged the heavy magnetic deadbolt on the primary glass doors. The solid metallic clack of the lock engaging resonated with an alarming finality. He then turned and locked the secondary exit. Julian stared at the operatives, his eyes wide, his hand freezing midair. The porcelain mug slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering instantly, sending a spray of cold black coffee across the polished wood and onto his expensive leather shoes. The sudden violent noise of the breaking mug shattered the remaining pretense of corporate decorum. "What is the meaning of this?" demanded Arthur, the oldest board member, his voice quavering as he pointed a shaking finger at the security detail. "You cannot lock us in here. This is false imprisonment. We will call the authorities." The lead operative did not react. He stood perfectly still, a silent sentinel enforcing a new regime. I turned my attention to the panicked board members. I did not raise my voice to compete with the escalating tension. I spoke with the quiet clarity of a judge reading a verdict. "The authorities have already been notified," I stated. "They are currently waiting in the lobby downstairs. However, they are not here for my security team. They are waiting to see if they will be required to execute federal arrest warrants." The panic in the room instantly transformed into a suffocating, terrified silence. I pulled a single thick folder from my briefcase and dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table. "No one is leaving this room," I announced, "until we discuss the fraudulent documents your chief executive officer prepared for the federal government and the subsequent attempts by your chairman to conceal those crimes. Welcome to the Vanguard acquisition process." Julian stared at the shattered pieces of his coffee mug, the dark liquid pooling around his expensive leather shoes. The reality of his confinement, enforced by the Vanguard security detail, finally overrode his shock. His fear violently transmuted into a desperate, flailing aggression. "You cannot do this!" Julian shouted, leaping up from his chair. His voice was shrill, cracking with panic. He pointed a trembling finger at the security operatives. "I am the chief executive officer. I demand you unlock those doors immediately. I am calling the police. I am having you all arrested for corporate espionage and kidnapping." He fumbled in his jacket pocket, retrieving his smartphone with clumsy urgency. I did not move to stop him. I did not signal the security detail to intervene. I merely watched him, offering a cold, unyielding silence. "Call them Julian," I said, my voice carrying clearly over his frantic breathing. The federal prosecutors waiting in the lobby would likely appreciate the convenience of an immediate escort to this boardroom. It saves them the trouble of navigating the elevator banks. Julian's thumb hovered over the screen. He looked at me, searching for a trace of a bluff. He found only the absolute certainty of a predator observing cornered prey. His hand slowly lowered the phone, slipping back into his pocket. He collapsed back into his chair, the final remnants of his executive bravado extinguished. I turned my attention to the center of the mahogany table, where the audio-visual interface was embedded into the polished wood. I produced a sleek, encrypted USB drive from my pocket and inserted it into the designated port. The massive digital monitor mounted on the far wall flared to life. "Gentlemen," I began, addressing the remaining board members who sat paralyzed in their chairs. "For the past 24 hours, Richard has likely fed you a narrative framing Vanguard Acquisitions as a hostile, illegal entity. He has assured you that your positions are secure and that the initial public offering will proceed as planned." I engaged the presentation remote. The first slide materialized on the screen. "He lied to you," I stated. The screen displayed a complex, undeniable financial schematic. It mapped the catastrophic trajectory of Sterling Medical over the past 48 hours. I did not present accusations. I presented verifiable, bloodless data. I guided them through the sequence. The screen illuminated the predatory mezzanine loan Julian had secured, pledging the entire controlling interest of the company as collateral. A collective gasp rippled through the older board members. Richard had clearly omitted this detail from his briefings. I advanced the slide. The screen now displayed the default notices from the 3 primary vendors, legally triggered by the emergency credit agreements Julian had blindly signed. The vendor defaults I explained, utilizing the precise terminology of corporate liquidation, activated the cross-default clause within the mezzanine loan. Sterling Medical became instantly, irretrievably insolvent. I clicked the remote again. The final schematic appeared, illustrating the flow of capital and equity. It detailed the massive sell-off by the retail investors, followed immediately by the automated acquisition sweep executed by Vanguard. The final graph displayed the precise execution of the debt-to-equity conversion legally triggered at midnight. The pie chart representing the capitalization table reconfigured itself in real time on the screen. The segments belonging to Richard and Julian vanished, absorbed into a massive, dominating block of crimson. A stark white number pulsed in the center of the crimson segment. 62%. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, heavy with the realization of total defeat. Vanguard Acquisitions currently controls 62% of the voting rights for Sterling Medical, I announced, letting the number hang in the air. We hold the unassailable majority. The remaining equity held by the executives in this room is effectively marginalized. You possess no voting power to override my directives. Richard slammed his fist onto the mahogany table. The sudden noise startled the older board members, causing several to flinch. "This is an illegal manipulation." Richard roared, his face mottled with a desperate, furious red. "You circumvented the board. You used predatory tactics to steal a legacy that does not belong to you. We will not recognize this acquisition." He stood up, towering over the table, attempting to leverage the physical intimidation that had served him for decades. He turned to the 5 board members. "We vote now," Richard commanded, his voice trembling with urgency. "We invoke emergency executive privilege. We vote to invalidate the Vanguard share conversion and immediately seek a federal injunction. I need a show of hands. We stand together as a family, as a unified board, to protect this company." Richard raised his right hand high, his eyes sweeping across the men he considered his loyal subordinates. I watched the 5 board members. These were men who had built their wealth on caution and self-preservation. They were not revolutionaries. They were survivors. They looked at Richard's raised hand. Then they looked at the massive red number projected on the screen. They looked at the silent, imposing security detail guarding the exits. Finally, they looked at me. They recognized the shift in the apex hierarchy. They understood that siding with Richard meant aligning with a sinking ship facing federal scrutiny. They knew who held the actual power. Not a single hand was raised. The 5 men stared resolutely at the polished surface of the table, avoiding Richard's desperate gaze. They had abandoned him. Richard stood alone, his arm raised in a pathetic, unanswered salute. The realization of his total isolation settled over him. His arm slowly dropped to his side. He sank back into his chair, looking suddenly very old, the fire in his eyes replaced by a dull, terrified comprehension. "The acquisition is recognized," I stated, finalizing the shift in power. "However, the change in ownership is merely the first item on today's agenda. The second item concerns the criminal liabilities accrued by the former executive team." I pressed the button on the presentation remote one final time. The screen flickered. The financial schematics vanished, replaced by a high-resolution scan of a legal document. It was the S-1 registration statement. The preliminary filing prepared for the Securities and Exchange Commission, detailing the financial health of the company prior to the public offering. I zoomed in on the signature page, magnifying the ink until it filled the entire screen. This document, I informed the captive audience, contains fabricated revenue projections designed to defraud federal regulators and retail investors. It is the cornerstone of a felony securities fraud scheme orchestrated by Julian. I paused, allowing the gravity of the accusation to settle over the room. I looked directly at my father, and as you can clearly see, I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. The fraudulent document bears the authorizing signature of the chairman of the board. The magnified signature glared from the screen, a digital indictment projected in stark black and white. The older board members shrank further into their leather chairs, desperately attempting to distance themselves from the radioactive evidence of federal fraud. They understood that associating with a falsified S-1 registration statement was career suicide. They were actively calculating their legal exposure. Richard stared at his own forged name on the massive monitor. The air seemed to leave his lungs in a sudden, sharp exhalation. He recognized the flawlessness of the forgery. He recognized the inescapable liability it represented. He turned his gaze toward Julian. The look contained no paternal warmth, only the cold, horrified realization that his chosen successor had engineered his destruction. Julian whimpered. It was not a corporate negotiation tactic. It was a visceral, involuntary sound of terror. He pressed himself into the corner of his chair, attempting to disappear. I reached into my briefcase. I withdrew 2 identical manila folders, thick with legal documentation, and tossed them onto the polished mahogany. They slid across the table, stopping abruptly in front of Richard and Julian. Inside those folders, I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the boardroom, our formal resignation agreements and irrevocable equity transfer documents. You will relinquish your executive titles immediately. Furthermore, you will transfer your remaining minority shares to Vanguard Acquisitions for the nominal sum of $1 per share. Julian's head snapped up. $1! He choked out the words. You are stealing our equity. We still hold 38%. You cannot legally force us to sell at a total loss. I leaned over the table, bracing my hands against the cool wood, closing the physical distance between us. The equity you hold is worthless, Julian, I stated, staring directly into his panicked eyes. It is attached to a company drowning in toxic debt and pending federal investigations. I am not offering you a financial buyout. I am offering you an exit strategy that keeps you out of a federal penitentiary. I straightened up, turning my attention to the entire room. If those documents are not signed and notarized within the next 5 minutes, I continued, my tone devoid of negotiation. I will instruct my security team to escort the federal prosecutor waiting in the lobby up to this boardroom. I will hand them the original encrypted files containing the forged SEC filings and the IP trace of the smear campaign. You will both be arrested for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy before you reach the elevators. Richard's hands trembled. He reached out and touched the manila folder, his fingers tracing the edge of the cardboard as if it were a physical lifeline. He looked at me, attempting to summon the patriarch who had dominated my life. Clara, he pleaded, his voice stripped of its resonance, reduced to a desperate, ragged whisper. This is the sterling legacy. My father started this company in a garage. I spent 40 years building it into an empire. You cannot simply erase our name from the door. You are destroying the family legacy. I looked at the man who had handed me a $2 greeting card to dismiss 5 years of my labor. The man who had forged documents to accuse me of stealing from his dead wife. He still believed legacy was defined by a name on a corporate letterhead. I met his gaze with absolute, unyielding clarity. You destroyed the legacy, Richard replied, the words landing like physical blows. You chose an incompetent heir because you valued submission over capability. You chose vanity over solvency. And when your decisions inevitably fractured the foundation, you attempted to burn me to hide your failures. I paused, allowing the silence to amplify the finality of my verdict. I am not destroying the legacy, I stated softly, lethally. I am the legacy. Julian broke first. The pressure of the impending federal indictment shattered his remaining resolve. A choked, guttural sob erupted from his throat. He reached for the pen, resting in the center console of the table. His hand shook violently, knocking the pen against the wood before he managed to grasp it. Tears streamed down his face, ruining his manicured appearance. He did not read the dense legal language outlining his surrender. He hastily scrawled his signature across the transfer documents, the ink jagged and uneven, the frantic strokes of a man signing away his life to save his freedom. He pushed the folder back toward me, burying his face in his hands, weeping openly in front of the board he had intended to lead. Richard watched his son collapse. He looked down at his own folder. The fight was entirely gone from his eyes. He possessed no leverage, no allies, and no escape route. He was a defeated sovereign staring at the terms of his exile. Slowly, deliberately, Richard picked up his pen. He opened the folder and turned to the signature page. He paused, the pen hovering above the dotted line. He looked at the clauses detailing the complete surrender of his assets. His eyes widened, snapping to a specific paragraph buried within the equity transfer agreement. The color drained from his face for a second time, a fresh wave of horror replacing the resignation. Clara Richard breathed, his voice barely audible. The cross-collateralization clause. You included the personal guarantees. I nodded, maintaining my stoic posture. The mezzanine loan Julian signed required extensive collateral, I explained. He pledged the company equity. However, to secure the necessary volume of capital, the lenders required a secondary guarantee. Julian pledged your personal assets as a secondary guarantor, utilizing the broad power of attorney you granted him during the succession transition. Richard stared at the document, the devastating reality crystallizing in his mind. When you sign that transfer relinquishing the corporate equity to Vanguard, I continued outlining the mechanical execution of his ruin. The debt remains. The primary collateral is removed. The secondary guarantees are immediately activated to satisfy the outstanding balance. Richard dropped the pen. It clattered against the table. You are taking the house. I am executing the terms of the loan your chosen successor authorized. I corrected him. The bank holding the secondary guarantee will initiate foreclosure proceedings on the Mercer Island estate by the end of the business day. He had not just lost the company. He had lost the mansion, the symbol of his wealth, the physical embodiment of his perceived superiority. He was entirely, undeniably bankrupt. Sign the document, Richard, I commanded, or the prosecutor comes upstairs. With a trembling hand, Richard retrieved the pen. He signed his name, the strokes weak and hesitant, finalizing the absolute eradication of his empire. 30 days can erase a century of corporate history if the architect holds the correct tools. I systematically dismantled the remnants of my father's regime with a ruthless, calculated efficiency. The mahogany boardroom table stained with Julian's spilled coffee and desperate tears was dismantled and sold to a liquidator. The 5 board members who sat in silent complicity during the hostile takeover received their termination notices via certified courier on a Tuesday morning. I did not offer them golden parachutes or dignified exit packages. I offered them the grace of avoiding federal subpoenas regarding their fiduciary oversight failures. They signed the non-disclosure agreements without uttering a single word of protest and vanished into their affluent suburban retirements. I filed the Articles of Amendment with the Secretary of State the following week, officially dissolving the Sterling medical name. The entity was reborn as Vanguard Health Systems. The bloated marketing contracts Julian had championed were shredded. The supply chains were restructured under the efficient protocols I had designed years ago while operating in the shadows. The stock, now stabilized and backed by actual verifiable capital instead of fraudulent projections, began a slow, steady climb. The financial hemorrhage was contained. The company was finally functioning as a rational enterprise. I stood in the renovated executive suite reviewing the quarterly revenue projections when the glass doors parted. Maya walked into the office. The heavy defensive posture she carried during her marriage had entirely evaporated. She wore a tailored ivory suit, radiating the lethal confidence of a woman who had just successfully navigated a high-stakes legal extraction. Her divorce decree was finalized 48 hours prior. Utilizing the forensic accounting data Vanguard provided, she had systematically stripped Julian of his remaining hidden assets, leaving him with a mountain of legal debt and a permanently tarnished reputation in the Seattle legal community. I poured 2 glasses of sparkling water from the console, sliding one across the desk toward her. "Welcome to Vanguard Health," I said, taking my seat. Maya picked up the glass. She surveyed the corner office, her gaze lingering on the sweeping view of the Puget Sound and the bustling harbor below. "The title of Chief Legal Officer suits you," I added, watching her observe the domain we had conquered. She offered a sharp, genuine smile. "It is certainly a substantial upgrade from playing defense for a sinking ship." She placed a thick leather binder on my desk. "I have finalized the severance of all remaining vendor liabilities. We are officially insulated from any residual fallout stemming from Julian's unauthorized credit agreements." We reviewed the operational transition for the next hour. Maya possessed an unparalleled intellect for regulatory compliance and risk mitigation. With her commanding the legal division, the company was fortified against any lingering liabilities from Richard's archaic era. We operated with a synchronized clinical efficiency. We were 2 women who had been chronically underestimated by the same men now occupying the executive thrones those men had forfeited through their own arrogance. As Maya departed to brief her legal team on the new corporate governance standards, the private line on my desk chimed. Very few individuals possessed that direct routing number. I glanced at the digital display. The caller identification indicated a generic prepaid mobile device originating from a local area code. I tapped the screen to connect the audio. Clara. The voice was thin, raspy, stripped of its baritone authority. It was the sound of a man who had lost his kingdom and his identity. The bank had foreclosed on the Mercer Island estate 3 weeks ago, executing the secondary guarantee on the mezzanine loan without mercy. The luxury vehicles were repossessed from the driveway. The country club memberships were revoked due to unpaid dues and the ensuing public scandal. Richard was currently residing in an extended stay motel near the interstate highway, surviving on the dregs of a depleted retirement account that the aggressive creditors had not yet located. "Clara, please," Richard pleaded, his voice breaking with a pathetic, unfamiliar tremor. "I have nowhere else to go. The lawyers will not return my calls. Julian is staying on a friend's couch and refuses to speak to me. He blames me for the forged documents. I just need a place to stay. You have the guest suite in the Bellevue penthouse. It would only be temporary, just until I can liquidate some minor assets and get back on my feet." He was still lying. There were no minor assets left to liquidate. Vanguard had seized everything of value. He was a destitute man begging the daughter he had publicly humiliated for a corner in her home. I listened to his ragged breathing through the speaker, hearing the distant muffled sound of highway traffic bleeding through his cheap phone connection. I felt no anger. I felt no pity. I felt the profound, sterile emptiness of a transaction that had been successfully concluded. I looked at the pristine surface of my desk, at the thriving company humming around me. I did not utter a single word in response. I simply reached forward and terminated the connection. The line went dead, plunging his pleas back into the silence he deserved. I did not leave him entirely without a response, however. I believe in closing accounts with precise, proportional accuracy. The following morning, the front desk clerk at the Highway Motel handed Richard a padded envelope. It was delivered via standard postal mail, lacking any expedited or secure tracking features. Richard carried the envelope into his cramped, dimly lit room, sitting on the edge of the sagging, stained mattress. His hands shook as he tore open the paper flap. He anticipated a legal summons, a final eviction notice from the remaining creditors, or perhaps a formal cease and desist order from my legal department. He reached inside and extracted the contents. It was a thin, cheap paper envelope. He recognized the shape and the weight instantly. The realization struck him before he even broke the seal. He opened the flap and pulled out a generic drugstore greeting card. The cover featured a cartoon bear giving an enthusiastic thumbs up. He opened the card with trembling fingers. Printed inside in standard black font were the words, "Thanks for pitching in." Taped securely beneath the printed text was a plastic gift card for a discount regional supermarket. The balance loaded onto the card was exactly $100. There was no handwritten note, there was no signature, there was no return address. The gesture was a perfect mirrored reflection of the dismissal he had handed me on the night he crowned his son. It was the final devastating receipt. It was the absolute quantification of his worth to me. He had handed me a $2 card to dismiss 5 years of my labor. I handed him the exact same card to dismiss his entire existence. The cycle was complete. I stood in the center of my corner office, the floor-to-ceiling glass, offering an unobstructed commanding view of the Seattle skyline. The storm clouds had finally cleared, revealing the sharp geometric lines of the financial district bathed in brilliant sunlight. The chaotic noise of the past month was gone, replaced by the steady, profitable hum of a functional empire. The toxic debt was cleared. The corporate legacy was rewritten. I had walked out of a steakhouse with nothing but a $2 card and a promise to myself to eradicate their control over my life. Now I owned the horizon. I was no longer the reliable bookkeeper. I was no longer the invisible daughter serving the egos of incompetent men. I raised my coffee cup, taking a slow, satisfying sip. I stood at the pinnacle of the medical industry, the undisputed architect of the Vanguard Empire, gazing down at a city I had conquered in absolute silence. Looking out over the Seattle skyline, I realized the most profound shift is not the title on my office door or the billions in assets under Vanguard's management. It is the pristine silence in my mind. For 34 years, the noise of my father's expectations and my brother's entitlement crowded my every decision. They demanded my compliance while mocking my capabilities. Now, there is only the quiet clarity of a life built strictly on my own terms. I did not inherit a dynasty. I conquered one. Colleagues in the financial sector often ask how I dismantled my own bloodline with such clinical precision. They view the takeover as a ruthless corporate maneuver. I view it as a necessary act of survival. If you ever find yourself trapped in the shadow of toxic egos, waiting for validation that will never arrive, keep these 3 truths in mind. First, embrace being underestimated. When people assume you lack ambition, they stop watching your hands. My father categorized me as a harmless clerk, which granted me unhindered access to map the structural vulnerabilities of his entire enterprise without raising a single alarm. Invisibility is not a burden. It is the ultimate tactical camouflage. Let them believe you are content in the background while you silently gather the leverage. Second, DNA does not grant amnesty for manipulation. Society conditions us to tolerate disrespect and exploitation simply because the perpetrators share our lineage. Loyalty must be a reciprocal currency. When relatives treat you as a disposable asset, you owe them no fiduciary duty. Sever the emotional contract the exact moment they prove they only value your submission. You are not obligated to sink with a ship captained by fools just because you share their last name. Third, true power never needs to shout. Julian screamed when he lost his title. Richard slammed his fists against mahogany tables in a desperate bid to project strength. I merely plugged in a flash drive and presented the receipts. Anger is a reaction. Execution is a strategy. Build your foundation in the dark, secure your documentation, and wait until the exit doors are firmly locked before you reveal your hand. The most devastating checkmate is always delivered in a whisper. The $2 greeting card my father handed me was intended to be a period at the end of my career. Instead, I used it to write an entirely new narrative. You hold the pen to your own life. Do not let anyone relegate you to the footnotes. If you have ever had to reclaim your worth from people who attempted to diminish you, I want to hear your experience. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Did I push the boundaries too far, or did the sterling men get exactly what they earned? Subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories for more narratives about resilience, setting ironclad boundaries, and outsmarting the architects of your pain. Until next time,